The events I'm about to recount took place last year on my uncle's ranch in Prescott, Arizona, where the rugged terrain of the Bradshaw Mountains meets the high desert. As a wildlife enthusiast and amateur naturalist, I've kept detailed journals of my observations for the past 5 years, documenting everything from the seasonal migration patterns of elk herds to the hunting behaviors of local mountain lions. The ranch itself spans several thousand acres of diverse terrain: pine forests, rocky outcroppings, and sprawling meadows where my uncle's sheep graze. What happened during those 2 weeks in October challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. The first day started normally enough. My wildlife journal entries from that morning read like any other: tracks from a black bear near the creek, a family of badgers den hunting in the lower meadow, and the usual parade of mule deer and elk moving through the property's well-worn game trails. The weather was typical for early autumn in the highlands, crisp mornings giving way to warm afternoons, with evening temperatures dropping rapidly after sunset. What made this day different occurred just after dusk. I was in my favorite observation blind, a well-concealed structure overlooking one of the property's main game trails, when the forest fell silent. Anyone who spends time in the wilderness knows that sudden silence usually means one thing: the presence of a major predator. But this silence felt different, heavier somehow, as if the very air had become dense with anticipation. The moon was nearly full, providing excellent visibility across the clearing. That's when I saw them. A family group moving through the trees with an ease that seemed impossible for their size. Having studied primates extensively through documentaries and research papers, I immediately noticed their similarity to great apes, particularly in their fluid movement patterns. The largest individual, which I presumed to be the alpha male, had a distinctive silvery sheen to its fur reminiscent of a silverback gorilla but standing significantly taller. I estimated at least 8 feet in height. They moved through my field of view without any sign of aggression or awareness of my presence. Unlike many reported Bigfoot sightings, there was no wood knocking, no strong odors, no aggressive displays. They simply passed through, following the game trail like any other wild animal seeking prey or moving between territories. I noted how they kept to the shadows of the larger pines, their movements suggesting a deep familiarity with the terrain. The second night brought an entirely different kind of encounter, one that still makes my hands shake when I record it in my journal. My uncle had previously told me about an incident years ago when he had to shoot at a creature while protecting his sheep, something he described as walking like a man but shaped like a wolf. I'd always filed that story away as an example of the ranch's colorful history, perhaps a misidentified bear or mountain lion seen in poor lighting conditions. That skepticism evaporated when I found the sheep pen's gate torn open, its heavy-gauge steel hinges bent as if they were made of tin foil. A trail of blood led away from the pen, accompanied by tracks that defied explanation. They started as clear canine prints, but gradually elongated and deepened, as if the creature's weight and stance had shifted as it moved. Following the blood trail was probably foolish, but my scientific curiosity overwhelmed my sense of self-preservation. The trail led me to a clearing where I found evidence of what had happened to the missing sheep. The scene was unlike anything I'd seen from natural predators, and I've documented plenty of wolf and mountain lion kills. This was different. The carcass hadn't just been consumed, it had been deliberately arranged, almost ritualistically. Looking at my journal entry from that night, I noted how the creature had separated different parts of the animal with almost surgical precision. That's when I heard it, a sound that started as a wolf's howl but transformed into something else, something that carried too much intelligence to be purely animal. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. I retreated to my elevated deer stand, knowing that height often provides safety from terrestrial predators. What I saw from that vantage point still haunts my dreams. The third night brought an encounter that challenged not just my understanding of natural history, but of reality itself. I was back in my deer stand, attempting to document normal wildlife activity, when the atmosphere changed. The temperature dropped suddenly, and an overwhelming smell of decay filled the air. Not the normal scent of decomposition you might find in the woods, but something older, something that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. What emerged from the shadows appeared at first glance to be a deer, but standing upright on two legs. Its proportions were wrong, limbs too long, joints bent at impossible angles, its rib cage visible through skin that seemed stretched to breaking point. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. They contained an intelligence that was unmistakably human, yet utterly alien at the same time. The creature noticed my presence immediately, its head snapping toward my position with unnatural speed. What followed was hours of psychological warfare. The thing circled our cabin all night, alternating between the sound of a woman crying, a child laughing, and that horrible bone-chilling screech that seemed to vibrate at a frequency that made my teeth ache. The smell of decay became so intense that I nearly vomited several times. My uncle later told me that what I'd encountered was likely a skinwalker, a creature from Native American lore that he'd warned me about but I'd never taken seriously. The local tribal elders have long spoken of these beings, describing them as medicine men who gained the power to transform into animals through dark practices. The description matches precisely what I witnessed. A being that seemed caught between human and animal form, exuding an aura of ancient malevolence. Morning finally came, but the experience left an indelible mark on my psyche. The smell lingered for days, seeming to permeate everything on the property. My wildlife journals from the following days show a marked decrease in normal animal activity, as if the local wildlife could sense that something unnatural had invaded their territory. Looking back at these events a year later, I'm struck by how they challenged my scientific worldview. As a dedicated wildlife observer, I'm trained to look for rational explanations, to document everything with clinical detachment. But what happened during those 3 nights defied conventional explanation. The Bigfoot family, while extraordinary, at least operated within the realm of biological possibility. The Dogman pushed the boundaries of what I thought possible in terms of physical adaptation. But the Skinwalker, that encounter forced me to confront the possibility that there are things in this world that operate outside the bounds of natural law altogether. After several days of relative quiet following the Skinwalker incident, I decided to investigate a series of caves on the western edge of my uncle's property. The local geology, dominated by ancient limestone formations, had created an extensive network of underground passages that I'd previously documented for their bat populations. My uncle had always warned me about going too deep into these caves, citing old tribal warnings about things that sleep beneath the earth. Armed with my usual field gear plus additional lighting and safety equipment, I began a systematic survey of the main cave entrance. The temperature drop was immediate and severe, typical for these underground systems, but something about the air quality felt wrong. My digital thermometer showed a reading of 52 degrees Fahrenheit, but it felt much colder, with an unusual dampness that seemed to cling to my skin. The first unusual sign appeared about 100 feet in, petroglyphs that I'd never noticed before, despite having visited these caves dozens of times. The images depicted what appeared to be tall, thin figures with elongated limbs, surrounded by smaller, more human-like forms in poses, suggesting supplication or worship. The artistry was crude, but conveyed a sense of movement that made the figures seem almost alive in the beam of my headlamp. I returned to the caves the next day with better documentation equipment, a high-resolution camera, detailed mapping tools, and a digital voice recorder for notes. The petroglyphs had sparked my scientific curiosity, overwhelming any lingering fear from the previous week's encounters. What I found deeper in the cave system challenged my understanding of both geology and biology. About 200 feet in, the limestone walls gave way to a different type of rock formation that I couldn't identify. The surface was smooth, almost glassy, with patterns that resembled circuit boards more than natural mineral deposits. My attempts to take samples proved futile. The material was harder than anything I'd encountered in my geological surveys. The real shock came when I reviewed my photographs that evening. Every image taken near the unusual rock formation showed strange distortions, not the typical camera artifacts or lighting issues, but geometric patterns that seemed to hover just at the edge of comprehension. Even more disturbing, several photos captured what appeared to be figures standing in the background, visible only when the images were enhanced. They matched the shapes from the petroglyphs, impossibly tall, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. The third day of cave exploration proved to be the most terrifying. I'd penetrated deeper into the system than ever before, following a narrow passage that seemed to spiral downward at an impossible angle. My mapping equipment began malfunctioning, showing contradictory readings that suggested I was simultaneously descending and ascending. The passage eventually opened into a chamber that defied all logical explanation. The walls pulsed with a faint bioluminescence, revealing a space that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. At the center stood what I can only describe as a doorway, a perfect rectangular opening in the rock face that appeared to lead nowhere, yet somehow felt like it led everywhere at once. The air near the doorway rippled like heat waves rising from hot asphalt, but the temperature readings showed a steady drop the closer I got to it. My voice recorder captured something that I didn't hear at the time, a low-frequency hum that, when analyzed later, contained patterns too regular to be natural cave acoustics. What happened next still feels like a dream, but my journal entries and recordings confirm the reality of it. As I stood studying the doorway, the chamber's bioluminescence intensified, and figures began emerging from the shadows. They moved with a fluid grace that made my brain hurt, trying to process their locomotion, as if they were flowing through dimensions that human eyes weren't meant to perceive. These weren't the cryptids from the previous week. These beings seemed to exist at the intersection of biology and geometry, their forms constantly shifting between shapes that appeared almost human and configurations that defied Euclidean space. They made no sound, but I felt their communication as pressure changes in my skull, concepts and images that my consciousness struggled to translate into coherent thoughts. The final day of my investigation brought everything full circle. I awoke in my bed at the ranch house with no memory of leaving the cave, but my clothes were covered in a fine, iridescent powder that seemed to evaporate when touched. My uncle was waiting for me in the kitchen, his expression grave. He revealed that his family had been guardians of this land for generations, not just as ranchers, but as keepers of an ancient trust. The caves, he explained, were more than just geological formations. They were thresholds to something else, something that the local tribes had known about for millennia. The cryptids I'd encountered in the first week weren't separate phenomena, but manifestations of whatever existed beyond those thresholds, bleeding through into our reality. A year has passed since these events, and I've struggled with how to present this information to the scientific community. My background in wildlife biology and geology provides no framework for understanding what I encountered, yet my detailed journals, photographs, and recordings prove that something extraordinary occurred during those 2 weeks. The ranch continues its normal operations. The sheep graze peacefully in their pastures, the elk and deer follow their ancient migration patterns, and the daily rhythm of ranch life goes on. But sometimes, especially during the full moon, I hear sounds carrying across the valley that don't match any known wildlife. The cave entrance has been sealed with heavy steel doors, marked with warnings in multiple languages and symbols whose meaning I'm only beginning to understand. I continue my wildlife observations, but my journals now include a separate section for phenomena that don't fit into conventional biological classifications. The local tribal elders have begun sharing more of their traditional knowledge with me, teaching me to recognize the signs of when the boundaries between worlds grow thin. Perhaps most importantly, I've learned that there are some mysteries that science isn't ready to explain, some truths that can only be understood by accepting that our reality is far stranger and more complex than we imagine. The creatures I encountered, the Bigfoot family, the Dogman, the Skinwalker, and those beings in the cave, may someday be explained by advances in our understanding of physics, biology, or dimensions we haven't yet discovered. Until then, they remain what they've always been, reminders that we are not alone in this world, and that some frontiers of knowledge are better approached with humility and respect, rather than pure scientific skepticism. The open road had been my home for over 5 years now. My partner and I had embraced the nomadic lifestyle, living in our van and traversing the country. We'd seen it all, from the bustling cities to the quietest corners of national forests. Our experiences had taught us to approach the world with an open mind, ready for whatever came our way. On this particular night, we found ourselves in Denver, Colorado. The city was alive with energy, even as midnight approached. We had spent the evening exploring the vibrant Rhino district, admiring the colorful murals and street art that adorned the buildings. The creative spirit of the area was palpable, and we reveled in the atmosphere of artistic expression. As the night wore on, our wanderings led us down an alley behind an old Catholic church. The stone walls of the church loomed over us, their weathered surface telling silent stories of decades gone by. The alley was quiet, save for the distant hum of the city and the soft padding of our footsteps on the pavement. It was then that we noticed a figure huddled in a doorway. As fellow travelers, albeit of a different sort, we always tried to approach such situations with empathy and respect. We knew all too well the vulnerability of sleeping in public spaces and the importance of preserving one's dignity. As we drew closer, I steeled myself for the encounter, reminding myself not to stare or make assumptions. But despite my mental preparation, I couldn't help the surge of adrenaline that coursed through me as we passed by. The woman was sitting up, her back pressed against the corner of the doorway. Her skin had a grayish tinge, and her long black hair hung in tangled strands around her face. But it was her eyes that caught and held my attention. They were unnaturally wide, seeming to bulge slightly from their sockets, and her lips were pulled back in what looked like a permanent grimace. I've encountered many individuals struggling with addiction in my travels, particularly on the West Coast where the methamphetamine epidemic has left its mark on countless lives. But this woman didn't give off the frantic, wired energy I associated with meth use. Instead, there was something profoundly unsettling about her stillness, as if she was suffering from some terrible illness that had ravaged her body and mind. As we passed, I offered a gentle smile and quickly averted my gaze, not wanting to make her uncomfortable. It was then that she spoke, her voice soft but clear in the quiet of the alley. "What's it called when you don't believe in God anymore?" The question hung in the air, unexpected and oddly poignant. My partner, without missing a beat, replied, "I think it's agnostic." We continued walking, picking up our pace slightly as we rounded the corner out of the alley. Once we were out of earshot, I turned to my partner, my heart still racing. "That really scared me," I admitted. He tried to reassure me, but I could see the unease in his eyes as well. We found ourselves in front of a row of old apartment buildings that seemed completely at odds with the gentrified areas of Denver we'd seen earlier. They reminded me of the projects in New York or the shotgun houses of New Orleans, a pocket of urban decay that had somehow resisted the tide of modernization sweeping through the city. A strange playground structure sat atop a bush in front of one of the houses, its presence both whimsical and unsettling in the dim light. From one of the apartments, we could hear the muffled sounds of a television and someone shouting, the noise spilling out through an open door. The entire scene felt surreal. The dark alley, the woman with her haunting question, the looming church, and these out-of-place apartments. The soft glow of the streetlights cast everything in an eerie, dreamlike quality. For a moment it felt as if we had stepped out of time, or perhaps out of our familiar reality altogether. Later that night, as we settled into our van, my partner confessed that the encounter had shaken him as well. He admitted to putting on a brave face for my sake. But in truth, he had been just as disturbed as I was. We both struggled to put our feelings into words, but there was a shared sense that what we had experienced was somehow beyond the ordinary. The next night found us parked near a dog park by the boardwalk. As I slept, my partner stayed up late working on an art project. Around 2 a.m., he heard the sound of shuffling footsteps outside the van. Curious, he peered out the window and saw an elderly woman walking by. She wore a black beach hat perched atop thinning hair, her scalp visible beneath the sparse strands. Her eyes were deeply sunken, giving her a gaunt, sleepless appearance. Despite the late hour and cool temperature, she was dressed as if for a day at the beach. As she passed, she turned her head towards the van, her gaze seeming to look through the window without focusing on anything in particular. What struck my partner as truly bizarre was the sound coming from her. It wasn't speech, at least not in any language he recognized. Instead, it was a strange rhythmic noise that he likened to the sound of a radio being tuned, shifting between frequencies. The woman continued past the large side window of the van, but oddly, she never appeared in view of the front window. It was as if she had simply vanished into the night. When I woke briefly in the early hours and my partner recounted what he had seen, I felt a chill run down my spine. The experience seemed to echo our encounter from the previous night, leaving us both unsettled and questioning what we had witnessed. As travelers, we've learned to approach the world with an open mind, embracing the diverse experiences and individuals we encounter on our journey. But these 2 nights in Denver had shaken us, challenging our perceptions and leaving us with questions that defied easy answers. Were these simply individuals struggling with mental health issues, or the effects of a hard life on the streets? Or was there something more to these encounters? Something that touched on deeper, more mysterious aspects of human experience? As we drove out of Denver the next day, we found ourselves contemplating these questions, our conversation returning again and again to those strange encounters in the night. Our journey continued as it always did, but those experiences in Denver left an indelible mark on our memories. They served as a reminder that no matter how much of the world we see, there will always be mysteries that elude our understanding, moments that challenge our perceptions and leave us questioning the nature of reality itself. I'm so glad I wasn't awake for this because I would have lost it. As soon as I woke up in the middle of the night and he told me what happened, I instantly got chills. I don't know what to think about all this, but I would love to hear your theories. Do you think they were regular people? Wolf in sheep's clothing? Cryptids? Aliens? I'd love to hear your thoughts. The cool October air nipped at my face as I walked down the dimly lit street, the sound of crunching leaves beneath my feet, mixing with the distant laughter of children. It was Halloween night, and I was out trick-or-treating with my friends, just like any other high school freshman. The neighborhood was alive with the spirit of the holiday. Jack-o'-lanterns grinned from porches, fake cobwebs draped over bushes, and the occasional animatronic skeleton startled unsuspecting passers-by. We had started the night as a larger group, about 8 of us, all decked out in an assortment of costumes. I had chosen to go as a character from my favorite video game, complete with a plastic sword and a makeshift armor crafted from cardboard and duct tape. My best friend, let's call her Rachel, was dressed as a witch, her pointed hat slightly askew and her face painted a ghastly green. Our other friend, who I'll refer to as Michael, had opted for a classic vampire look, his face pale with fake blood dripping from the corners of his mouth. As the night wore on, our large group gradually split up. Some wanted to hit up the houses known for giving out full-sized candy bars, while others were more interested in checking out the haunted house set up in old Mr. Johnson's garage. Before we knew it, Rachel, Michael, and I found ourselves separated from the rest. "Should we try to find the others?" Rachel asked, her voice muffled slightly by the fake wart on her chin. I shrugged, adjusting the strap of my candy-filled pillowcase over my shoulder. "Nah, we can meet up with them later. I heard there's a house on Maple Street that's giving out those big variety packs of chips." Michael's eyes lit up at the prospect of more snacks. "Lead the way, O mighty warrior," he said with a mock bow, his plastic fangs gleaming in the streetlight. We set off down the street, the distant sounds of Monster Mash and children's laughter fading behind us. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The houses here seemed older, more run down. The Halloween decorations were sparse and there were no other trick-or-treaters in sight. "Guys, I don't think this is Maple Street," I said, slowing my pace. "Maybe we should turn back." Rachel nodded, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders. "Yeah, this place gives me the creeps." Just as we were about to turn around, I spotted something at the end of the street. At first I thought it was just another Halloween decoration, maybe a particularly elaborate scarecrow. But as we got closer, I realized it was moving. It was a figure standing perfectly still on the corner where this street met the main road. From where we stood, I could see the brightly lit houses and the bustling Halloween activity on the other side. But here, in this strange, quiet street, there was just us and this being. As we approached, I could make out more details, and a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air. The figure looked exactly like a Neon Zanki spirit, a supernatural being from my grandfather's stories. It was tall and gaunt, with long, spindly limbs that seemed too thin to support its body. Its skin was a pale ashen gray, and its eyes were completely black, like two bottomless pits in its face. I felt Rachel grab my arm, her nails digging into my skin through my costume. "What is that thing?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, the being started moving. It wasn't walking, not really. It was more like it was gliding across the ground, its feet never seeming to touch the pavement, and it was coming straight for us. Michael let out a strangled whimper. "We need to get out of here. Now!" But as we turned to run, I realized the being wasn't coming for all of us. It was headed directly for Rachel. I saw the terror in her eyes, saw her frozen in place like a deer in headlights. In that moment, I knew I had to do something. Without thinking, I stepped in front of Rachel, placing myself between her and the advancing figure. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, but I forced myself to stand my ground. The being stopped right in front of me, its face mere inches from mine. Up close, it was even more terrifying. I could see now that its skin wasn't just gray. It seemed to shimmer and shift, like smoke given solid form. There was no warmth coming from it, no breath, no sign of life at all. Just those endless black eyes staring into mine. I could feel Rachel trembling behind me, her hand clutching mine so tightly it hurt. Michael was somewhere to my left, his breathing quick and panicked. But I kept my eyes locked on the being in front of me. Remember what Grandpa always said, I thought to myself. Show no fear, respect the spirits, but don't let them intimidate you. Taking a deep breath, I plastered what I hoped was a friendly smile on my face. "Happy Halloween," I said, proud of how steady my voice sounded. "It's a great night out, isn't it? And wow, that's a really cool costume. The special effects are amazing." The being didn't respond. It didn't move. It just kept staring at me with those bottomless eyes. I could feel sweat beading on my forehead under my costume, but I kept talking. You know, I've seen a lot of great costumes tonight, but yours really takes the cake. The makeup must have taken hours. Are you supposed to be some kind of ghost, or maybe a demon? Still no response. But I noticed something changing in those black eyes. Was it confusion? Curiosity? I couldn't be sure, but I pressed on. I especially like how you've done the skin. It looks almost alive, you know? Like it's moving. And the eyes. Man, those contacts must have cost a fortune. They look so real. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there in silence. Me rambling on about costume techniques and special effects. The being, silent and still as a statue. Rachel and Michael frozen in fear behind me. And then finally, something changed. The being blinked, actually blinked, and took a step back. It tilted its head to one side, regarding me with what I could only describe as bewilderment. Then, without a word, it turned and glided away, crossing the street to the other side. I watched it go, my heart still racing. It moved through the crowds of trick-or-treaters on the main street, none of whom seemed to notice anything unusual. As it disappeared into the night, I let out a long, shaky breath. Is it gone?" Rachel whispered, peeking out from behind me. I nodded, not trusting my voice just yet. Michael came up beside us, his face pale beneath his vampire makeup. "What the hell was that thing?" he asked, his voice cracking. I shook my head. "I don't know, but I think we should go home." We made our way back to the main street in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The cheerful Halloween atmosphere felt surreal after what we'd just experienced. As we reached my house, Rachel turned to me. "Thank you," she said quietly, for protecting me." I managed a small smile. That's what friends are for, right? After saying goodbye to Rachel and Michael, I went inside. My mom was in the kitchen sorting through her own candy stash from the trick-or-treaters. "Did you have a good time, honey?" she asked, looking up as I entered. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, it was interesting. Mom, can I talk to you about something?" She must have heard something in my voice because she immediately put down the candy and gave me her full attention. "Of course, sweetheart, what's wrong?" I took a deep breath and told her everything. About the strange street, the being that looked like a Nyanzanki spirit, how I'd stood up to it. As I spoke, I saw her expression change from concern to fear to something else. Pride, maybe? When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood up and went to the phone. "I'm calling your grandfather," she said. My grandfather was a respected medicine man on our reservation. I'd grown up listening to his stories about the spirit world, about the beings that existed beyond what most people could see. But I'd always thought they were just stories. I spoke to him that night, recounting everything that had happened. He listened without interrupting, and when I was done, he let out a long sigh. "You did well, my boy," he said, his voice gravelly over the phone. "You showed strength and respect, but what you saw, it was not a costume, and it was not something to be taken lightly." He explained that the being I'd encountered was indeed a spirit, one that shouldn't have been outside of our sacred lands. The fact that it had appeared on Halloween, when the veil between worlds was thin, was concerning. "We must perform a ceremony," he said, "to protect you and to restore balance. Come to the reservation this weekend." That weekend, my mom and I drove from Mesa to the reservation. The familiar landscape of the desert gave way to the rolling hills and sparse vegetation of my ancestral home. As we pulled up to my grandfather's house, I felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. The ceremony was unlike anything I'd experienced before. My grandfather burned sacred herbs, filling the air with sweet smoke. He chanted in our native language, words I only half understood but that resonated deep within me. As he worked, I felt a warmth spreading through my body, a sense of peace and protection settling over me like a blanket. When it was over, my grandfather sat with me outside, watching the sun set over the distant mountains. "You have a gift," he said, his weathered face serious. "The ability to see and interact with the spirit world is rare and valuable, but it also comes with great responsibility." He explained that by standing up to the spirit, by showing respect without fear, I had demonstrated a strength of character that the spirits recognized. But he warned me to be careful, to always show respect to the spiritual realm, and to never take unnecessary risks. "The world is full of mysteries," he said, "some beautiful, some dangerous. Your job is to learn to navigate them with wisdom and courage." As we drove back to Mesa the next day, I felt different, more aware, somehow, of the world around me. The encounter on Halloween had opened my eyes to a reality I'd only glimpsed before in my grandfather's stories. I knew that my life would never be quite the same. In the years that followed, I continued to have encounters with the spirit world. Some were frightening, others awe-inspiring. But I always remembered that Halloween night and the lessons I'd learned. Show respect, but don't show fear. Stand up for those who need protection. And always, always remember that there's more to this world than what most people see. As I sit here in the dim light of my study, the memories of that fateful hunting trip still send shivers down my spine. It's been a year since that horrifying night in the Blackwood Forest, but the events remain etched in my mind, as vivid as if they happened yesterday. I never thought I'd be telling this story, but perhaps by sharing it, I can finally exorcise the demons that have haunted me since. My name is Alex Winters, and I've been an avid hunter for most of my life. Growing up in the rural outskirts of Millbrook, a small town nestled in the heart of the Pacific Northwest, I learned to track and hunt from an early age. It was a skill passed down through generations in our community, a rite of passage of sorts. When my friends, who were relative novices to the world of hunting, approached me about joining them on their first expedition, I was hesitant at first. There's always a certain risk involved when taking inexperienced hunters into the wild, but their enthusiasm was infectious. Plus, I figured my expertise could help keep them safe. Little did I know that no amount of hunting experience could have prepared us for what awaited us in those woods. Our group consisted of 7 people: myself, my girlfriend Emma, my best friend and honorary brother Jake, his girlfriend Lily, our mutual friend Mike, Mike's girlfriend Rachel, and Lily's brother Tom. We were a tight-knit group, having known each other for years. We even shared a large old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, splitting the rent and enjoying each other's company. The day of the trip arrived, crisp and clear, with a hint of autumn in the air. We loaded up our gear into Jake's old Ford pickup and my Jeep Cherokee, the excitement palpable as we set off for Blackwood Forest. The drive was filled with laughter and anticipation, the radio blaring classic rock as we wound our way through the increasingly dense foliage. As we reached the forest's edge, I felt a strange unease settle over me. I brushed it off as nerves about leading such a large group of inexperienced hunters. We parked our vehicles in a small clearing and began unloading our gear. "All right, folks," I said, addressing the group. "Before we start setting up camp, we need to scope out the area. We'll look for good hiding spots, potential baiting locations, and get a general lay of the land. Stay close and keep your eyes and ears open." We set off into the forest, the canopy of ancient pines blocking out much of the afternoon sun. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. As we walked, I pointed out various tracks and signs of wildlife, sharing tips on how to move quietly through the underbrush. That's when we heard it, a sound that would change our lives forever. It started as a low, guttural growl, building into a rage-filled howl that echoed through the trees. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a mixture of primal fury and something almost human. Instinctively, Jake, Mike, and I formed a protective triangle around the others, drawing our hunting knives. The forest had gone eerily silent, save for the rapid beating of our hearts. "Alex," Emma whispered, her voice trembling, "can you smell anything?" I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, focusing all my attention on my sense of smell. Years of hunting had honed this ability, allowing me to pick up scents that others might miss. I inhaled deeply, sorting through the familiar forest odors, pine, earth, decaying leaves. Then something hit me, a scent so foul and unnatural that it made my stomach churn. My eyes snapped open, and I turned to the group, my voice low and urgent. "Listen to me very carefully. What I'm about to say might sound crazy, but you need to trust me. Our lives depend on it. Do you understand?" They nodded, fear evident in their eyes. "What we're dealing with, it's not natural. It's either a werewolf or a shapeshifter. I know how that sounds, but I need you to believe me. If we can't outrun this thing, Jake, Mike, and I will have to fight it. If that happens, I want the rest of you to run like hell back to the cars and get out of here. Don't look back. Just go." Emma stepped forward, her jaw set in determination despite the fear in her eyes. "No way, Alex. If we're going to die, we're going to die together. Got that, you overprotective idiot?" Before I could argue, another howl ripped through the air, much closer this time. We all looked at each other, a moment of silent understanding passing between us. "Run!" we yelled in unison, and then we were off, crashing through the underbrush. I don't know if we managed to gain some distance or if the creature was simply toying with us, but for a while it seemed like we might make it. Then I heard Tom's labored breathing behind me. He was falling behind. "Tom!" Lily screamed, trying to turn back for her brother. Jake grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. "We can't stop." That's when we heard it, the sickening sound of Tom's scream abruptly cut short. The forest echoed with growls and the wet, tearing sounds of... I couldn't bring myself to finish the thought. Somehow we made it back to the clearing where we'd parked. We piled into the vehicles, Jake gunning the engine of his pickup while I did the same with my Jeep. As we sped down the dirt road, I could see Lily in Jake's truck ahead of me, her face pressed against the window, her body racked with sobs. The drive back to our house was a blur. No one spoke. The only sounds were the roar of the engines and Lily's muffled cries. As soon as we arrived, we rushed inside, locking every door and window. "Upstairs now," I ordered, leading the group to my room. We grabbed the shotguns I kept locked in a gun safe, then barricaded ourselves inside. Hours passed in tense silence. As exhaustion began to set in, the others drifted off into uneasy sleep. Emma and I decided to head downstairs, both of us too wired to rest. In the dining room, Emma turned to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think he's really dead?" I swallowed hard, my voice shaky as I replied, "Yes." She came to me then, wrapping her arms around me in a fierce embrace. After a moment, she pulled away. "I'm going to make us some coffee. We're going to need it." I nodded, grateful for her strength. As she moved towards the kitchen, I found myself staring out the window into the darkness beyond. That's when I saw it, a pair of glowing golden eyes staring back at me from the tree line. The sound of shattering ceramics snapped me back to reality. I spun around to see Emma, frozen in place, her outstretched hand still positioned as if holding the now broken mug. Her other hand was pointing towards the window, trembling violently. I turned back, and there it was in full view. The creature stood at least 8 feet tall, its massive frame covered in jet-black fur. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly intelligence fixed directly on us. But it was the claws and fangs that truly drove home the horror of our situation. The claws were easily the size of large Bowie knives, wickedly curved and gleaming in the moonlight. I held up a hand, signaling for silence, Straining my ears, I caught the faintest sound, a low growl coming from the direction of the kitchen. I gestured to the others and we moved as one, rounding the corner with our weapons raised. There it stood, its massive form filling the doorway to the backyard. Up close, the creature was even more terrifying. Its muscles rippled beneath its fur, raw power evident in every line of its body. Its muzzle was pulled back in a snarl, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a roar that shook the very foundations of the house, the beast lunged forward. What happened next was a blur of motion and sound. We opened fire, the booming reports of our shotguns deafening in the confined space. The creature howled in pain and fury, its claws lashing out with lightning speed. I felt a sharp pain across my chest as one of its claws caught me, sending me stumbling backward. Jake let out a cry of pain as he was thrown against the wall. Mike kept firing, backing up as the beast advanced. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, another shotgun blast rang out. Emma stood in the doorway, her face a mask of determination as she pumped round after round into the creature. The beast let out an ear-splitting shriek, then turned and bounded out of the house, disappearing into the night. Emma lowered the shotgun, a small smile playing on her lips despite the fear in her eyes. "Looks like you boys needed some help after all." We spent the rest of the night huddled together in my room, jumping at every sound. As dawn broke, casting its pale light through the windows, we finally allowed ourselves to relax slightly. In the days that followed, we gave statements to the police about Tom's disappearance. Of course, we couldn't tell them the truth. Who would believe us? We said he'd gotten separated from the group, that we'd searched but couldn't find him. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead due to animal attack. Lily was devastated, blaming herself for not insisting they stay together. It took months of therapy and support from all of us before she started to heal. We all carried the scars of that night, both physical and emotional. We never saw the creature again, but its presence lingered in our nightmares and in the way we'd startle at unexpected sounds. We invested in better security systems, reinforced doors and windows, and never went into the woods unarmed. As I finish writing this account, I can't help but wonder if we'll ever truly be safe. Is the creature still out there, waiting for another chance? Or was it a one-time encounter with something beyond our understanding? One thing is certain. Our lives were forever changed that night in Blackwood Forest. We learned that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows of our rational, modern world. And sometimes, when the night is at its darkest and the wind howls through the trees, I find myself looking out into the darkness, half expecting to see those glowing golden eyes staring back at me. To anyone reading this, take heed. The wilderness holds secrets and dangers beyond our comprehension, and sometimes the hunter can all too easily become the hunted. The steering wheel was cool under my palms as I guided my old Subaru along the winding mountain road. My name is Olivia Chen, and I've been planning this solo photography trip to Echo Ridge for months. As a wildlife photographer, I'm used to solitude, but something about this journey felt different. The sun was sinking below the jagged peaks of the Rockies as I finally pulled into the nearly empty trailhead parking lot. Only a dusty red pickup truck kept my car company. I stepped out, breathing in the crisp mountain air, tinged with the scent of pine and distant snow. I did one last check of my gear: tent, sleeping bag, water filter, first aid kit, camera equipment, and enough food for 3 days. Everything was in order. I was just about to hit the trail when a Forest Service vehicle rumbled into the lot. A woman who looked to be in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes stepped out. "Evening," she called. "Heading up the trail?" I nodded, adjusting my backpack. "That's the plan. Is there anything I should know?" The ranger, whose name tag read Diane, frowned slightly. Actually, yes, we've had some concerning incidents recently. A hiker disappeared last week and we're still searching for him. A chill ran down my spine despite the warm evening. Disappeared? What happened? Diane shook her head. We're not sure. Ryan Cooper, 32, experienced outdoorsman. His partner reported him missing when he didn't return as scheduled. We found his campsite about 6 miles up, everything in order but no sign of him. I swallowed hard. That's unsettling. Any theories? Nothing concrete, Diane replied. No signs of animal attack or foul play. It's as if he just vanished into thin air. I weighed my options. I'd been looking forward to this trip for so long, but the news was concerning. I appreciate the heads up. I think I'll still go, but I'll be extra careful. Diane nodded, though she looked uneasy. All right, but please stick to the main trail and check in at the ranger station when you return. Take this as well. She handed me a small device. It's a satellite emergency beacon. Don't hesitate to use it if you encounter any trouble. I clipped the beacon to my pack, thanked her, and set off down the trail. As I walked, the fading light cast long shadows across my path, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something I didn't fully understand. As darkness settled over the forest, I found a suitable clearing and set up camp. The routine was familiar: pitching the tent, rolling out my sleeping bag, gathering wood for a small fire. But tonight, each snap of a twig under my feet made me jump. I started a fire, more for comfort than warmth, and settled down to review the day's photos on my camera. The night was alive with sounds: an owl's hoot, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. But underneath it all was an unsettling silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to dismiss it as nerves amplified by the ranger's story, but my instincts were screaming at me that something wasn't right. I was about to turn in when I heard it. A sharp crack echoing through the trees. It was the unmistakable sound of a branch breaking under weight. My heart began to race. I quickly extinguished my fire and retreated to my tent, zipping it up tightly. I lay still in my sleeping bag, every sense on high alert. For a long while, there was nothing. Then, just as I began to relax, I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my campsite. They were too regular, too purposeful to be an animal. I reached for my flashlight and the emergency beacon with trembling hands. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, afraid to make even the slightest sound. A shadow fell across the tent fabric. Someone was standing there. My finger hovered over the beacon's button, but before I could press it, the shadow moved away, and I heard the footsteps retreating into the forest. I remained frozen, heart racing, for what seemed like hours. Every sound, every rustle of leaves in the wind, sent a fresh wave of fear through me. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I fell into a restless sleep filled with dreams of dark forests and shadowy figures. I woke at dawn, momentarily disoriented. For a second, I hoped the night's events had been a dream. But as I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, reality came crashing back. There, in the soft earth around my campsite, were footprints. Large, boot-shaped prints that weren't mine. They circled my tent, exactly as I'd heard in the night. My hands shook as I photographed the prints. I needed evidence, needed to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining things. As I surveyed the area, something caught my eye: a metallic glint near the clearing's edge. Approaching cautiously, I found a small object half buried in the leaves. It was a compass, its glass cracked but the needle still swinging freely. My mind raced. Could this belong to the missing hiker? I carefully bagged the compass, intending to hand it over to the rangers. But as I stood, a chilling thought struck me. I was no longer alone in these woods, and whoever was out there might not want this compass found. I needed to get back to the trailhead, back to safety. I quickly broke camp, my photographer's curiosity at war with my growing sense of dread. Part of me wanted to press on, to unravel this mystery, but my instincts were screaming at me to leave. As I shouldered my pack and started down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching me from the dense forest on either side. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, sent my heart racing. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see a shadowy figure emerging from the trees. I had been hiking for about an hour, my nerves frayed and my senses on high alert, when I heard it, footsteps on the trail behind me. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The footsteps accelerated too. I was about to break into a run when a voice called out, "Hey, wait up!" I spun around, my hand on the emergency beacon. A man was jogging up the trail towards me. He appeared to be in his late 30s with a scruffy beard and a backpack similar to mine. "Sorry if I startled you," he said, slightly out of breath. "I'm Derek. I saw your campfire last night but didn't want to intrude. Thought I'd catch up and say hello this morning." I studied him warily, my body tense and ready to run. "I'm Olivia. Were you near my camp last night?" Derek looked confused. "No, I was camped about a half-mile back. Why do you ask?" I hesitated, then decided to trust my instincts. I told Derek about the footsteps, the prints, and the compass I'd found. As I spoke, I watched his face carefully, looking for any sign of deception. Derek's face grew serious. "That's unsettling. I heard about the missing hiker from the rangers. Do you think there could be a connection?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but I'm heading back to report what I found. It doesn't feel safe up here." Derek nodded. "Mind if I join you? I don't like the idea of anyone being alone out here right now." I agreed, relieved to have company but still wary. As we hiked back together, I couldn't help but wonder, was Derek really who he claimed to be? Or was he somehow connected to the strange events unfolding in these mountains? As Derek and I made our way down the trail, the sky began to darken ominously. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees and carrying the scent of rain. "Looks like a storm's coming," Derek observed, glancing up at the roiling clouds. "We should find shelter soon." I nodded, feeling a knot of anxiety in my stomach. The last thing we needed was to be caught in a downpour, especially with night approaching. We quickened our pace, searching for any suitable shelter. That's when I spotted it, a small cabin, barely visible through the dense foliage. "Look," I said, pointing. "Maybe we can wait out the storm there." Derek squinted in the direction I was pointing. "Good eye. Let's check it out." As we approached the cabin, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. It looked old and weathered, clearly long abandoned. The wooden walls were gray with age, and vines crept up the sides. Derek tried the door. To our surprise, it swung open with a creak. We stepped inside just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. The interior of the cabin was sparse, a rusty wood stove in one corner, a rickety table and chairs, and a narrow cot against the far wall. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. "Looks like no one's been here in years," I said, setting down my backpack. Derek nodded, moving to the window to peer out at the worsening storm. "We might be here for a while. Should we try to get a fire going in that stove?" I agreed, and we set about gathering what dry wood we could find. As Derek worked on starting the fire, I explored the cabin more thoroughly. That's when I noticed something odd, a trapdoor in the floor, partially hidden under an old rug. "Derek," I called, my voice shaky. "You need to see this." He came over, his eyebrows rising as he saw what I was pointing at. "A cellar, maybe?" We looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. Could this be connected to the disappearances? With trembling hands, I reached for the iron ring on the trap door. It was heavy, but with Derek's help we managed to lift it. A wave of musty air hit us as we peered into the darkness below. Derek shone his flashlight down, revealing a ladder leading into a small cellar, I'm going down there, I said, surprised by my own boldness. Derek looked uncertain. Are you sure that's a good idea? I wasn't sure at all, but something was driving me forward. I need to know what's down there. Watch my back? He nodded, and I began to descend the ladder. The cellar was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of earth and decay. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I gasped. The walls were covered in maps, photographs, and scribbled notes. In the center of the room was a table strewn with more papers and what looked like camping gear. Derek, you need to see this, I called up. He climbed down, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. What is all this? I picked up one of the papers from the table. It was a list of names and dates. With a chill, I realized they were all dates of reported disappearances in the area, going back years. I think we just stumbled onto something big, I whispered. Suddenly, we heard a noise from above, the creak of the cabin door opening. We froze, looking at each other in panic. Someone else was here. Heavy footsteps moved across the floor above us. Derek quickly switched off his flashlight, plunging us into darkness. We huddled in silence, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps stopped, right above the trapdoor. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would give us away. Then, slowly, the trapdoor began to open. Time seemed to stand still as the trapdoor inched open. A beam of light pierced the darkness, and I instinctively pressed myself against the damp cellar wall, trying to become one with the shadows. Derek was beside me, his breathing shallow and controlled. A figure descended the ladder, and I felt my heart skip a beat as I recognized the silver-streaked hair. It was Diane, the ranger from the trailhead. She reached the bottom of the ladder and swept her flashlight around the cellar, the beam catching the glint of fear in our eyes as it passed over us. Olivia? Derek? Her voice was a mix of surprise and, was that relief? What are you doing down here? We stepped forward, confusion written across our faces. We could ask you the same thing, I said, my voice shakier than I'd like. Diane sighed heavily, her shoulders sagging. I suppose it was only a matter of time before someone stumbled onto this. She moved to the table in the center of the room and switched on an old oil lamp, casting a warm glow around the cellar. What is all this? Derek asked, gesturing to the maps and photos covering the walls. Diane ran a hand through her hair, suddenly looking much older than she had at the trailhead. It's a long story and not a pretty one, but I suppose you deserve to know now that you're here. She began to explain, and as she spoke, the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. The disappearances in Echo Ridge weren't random accidents or the work of some mysterious predator. They were calculated, deliberate acts. There's a group, Diane said, her voice low. They call themselves the Guardians of the Wild. They believe that humans have no place in these mountains, that we're destroying the natural balance, and they've taken it upon themselves to discourage people from coming here. I felt sick to my stomach. You mean they're responsible for the missing hikers? For Ryan Cooper? Diane nodded grimly. They don't usually harm people, just scare them. Make them think the mountains are haunted or dangerous. But lately they've become more aggressive. Ryan, he stumbled onto something he shouldn't have. I've been trying to find him, to get him out before it's too late. And this place? Derek asked, looking around the cellar. My base of operations, Diane replied. I've been tracking the Guardians for years, trying to gather enough evidence to bring them down. But they're careful, and they have supporters in high places. My mind was reeling. So last night at my campsite, that was me, Diane admitted. I was trying to scare you off the trail. I'm sorry, but I thought it was safer than letting you wander into their territory. 1,000 questions swirled in my mind, but before I could voice any of them, we heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Voices coming from outside the cabin. Diane's eyes widened. They're here. We need to move now. She quickly gathered some papers from the table and stuffed them into her pack. There's a tunnel, she said, moving to the far wall and pushing aside a heavy crate to reveal a dark opening. It leads to a cave system. It's our only way out. As the voices grew closer, we had no choice but to trust her. We grabbed our packs and followed Diane into the darkness, the sound of the cabin door bursting open echoing behind us as we fled into the unknown depths of Echo Ridge. The tunnel was narrow and damp, the air thick with the musty smell of earth and decay. We moved as quickly as we dared, our path illuminated only by the weak beams of our flashlights. The voices from the cabin grew fainter as we delved deeper into the mountain. "Where does this tunnel lead?" I whispered to Diane, who was leading our small group. "To an old mining complex," she replied, her voice barely audible. "The Guardians don't know about it. At least I don't think they do. It's our best chance of getting out of here undetected." We continued in silence, the only sounds our labored breathing and the occasional drip of water from the tunnel ceiling. I tried to keep track of our twists and turns, but soon lost all sense of direction in the pitch-black maze. After what felt like hours, the tunnel began to widen, and I could feel a change in the air. It was fresher somehow. Suddenly, Diane stopped. "We're here," she said, her flashlight beam revealing a rusty metal door set into the rock face. With some effort, we managed to push the door open, its hinges protesting loudly. We stepped through into a vast cavern, the beams of our flashlights barely penetrating the darkness. The air was cool and damp, with a faint metallic scent that hinted at the area's mining history. "Welcome to the Echo Ridge Mine," Diane said, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "It's been abandoned for decades, but it might just be our salvation tonight." As our eyes adjusted to the gloom, I could make out the remnants of mining equipment scattered around. Rusted carts, broken pickaxes, and rotting support beams. It was like stepping back in time. "We should be safe here for now," Derek said, shining his light around the cavern. "But what's our next move?" Diane pulled out a weathered map from her pack. "There's an old emergency exit that leads out to a different part of the mountain. If we can reach it, we should be able to circle back to the ranger station without the Guardians catching on." As Diane studied the map, I couldn't help but voice the question that had been nagging at me. "Diane, how did you get involved in all this? Why are you working alone?" She sighed heavily, her face etched with weariness in the harsh light of our flashlights. "It's a long story, but the short version is that my brother was one of the first to disappear in these mountains. The official investigation went nowhere, so I joined the Forest Service to find answers. Over time, I uncovered the Guardians' activities, but I didn't have enough evidence to go to the authorities. And to be honest, I wasn't sure who I could trust." Her revelation hung in the air, the weight of her solitary mission palpable in the silence of the cavern. "Well, you're not alone anymore," I said firmly, surprising myself with my resolve. Derek nodded in agreement. A ghost of a smile crossed Diane's face. "Thank you. Now let's get moving. We have a long way to go, and I'm not sure how much of a head start we have." We set off into the depths of the mine, our footsteps echoing off the rocky walls. The path was treacherous, littered with debris and unexpected drops. More than once we had to help each other across gaps where the floor had caved in, revealing dizzying depths below. As we navigated through the labyrinthine tunnels, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every echo sounded like distant footsteps. The oppressive darkness played tricks on our minds, and the tension was palpable. After what felt like hours of walking, we reached a junction where the tunnel split into 3 separate paths. Diane consulted her map, her brow furrowed in concentration. "The exit should be down the right path," she said, but there was a note of uncertainty in her voice. As we were about to head down the right tunnel, a sound froze us in our tracks. It was faint, but unmistakable. voices coming from the tunnel behind us. "They've found the entrance," Derek whispered, his face pale in the flashlight's glow. "Run," Diane commanded, and we took off down the right tunnel, our earlier caution forgotten in the face of immediate danger. We ran through the darkness, our flashlights bouncing wildly, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The voices behind us grew louder, accompanied by the sound of multiple footsteps. Suddenly, the tunnel opened up into another large cavern. In the center was an old elevator shaft, a rickety-looking cage hanging precariously from rusted cables. "The emergency exit is up there," Diane gasped, pointing to a ledge high above us. "That elevator is the only way up." We looked at each other, the same thought crossing all our minds. Could that ancient contraption possibly still work? And even if it did, would it hold our weight? The sound of our pursuers grew closer. We were out of options and out of time. "Let's go," I said, stepping towards the elevator. "It's our only chance." As we piled into the rusty cage, I couldn't help but wonder if we were trading one danger for another. The door creaked shut behind us, and Diane reached for the control lever. With a groan of protesting metal, the elevator began to move. The ancient elevator shuddered and creaked as it slowly ascended the shaft. Every groan of metal and every jerk of the cage sent my heart racing. I gripped the rusty railing tightly, my knuckles white with tension. Come on," Diane muttered under her breath, her eyes fixed on the approaching ledge above. The voices of our pursuers echoed up the shaft, growing louder with each passing second. They were close, too close. Suddenly, with a sickening lurch, the elevator ground to a halt, still a good 10 feet below the ledge. No, Derek said, frantically pressing the control buttons. But it was no use. The ancient machinery had given up. "We'll have to climb," I said, eyeing the distance to the ledge. It wasn't impossible, but it wouldn't be easy either. Without warning, a beam of light shot up the elevator shaft, momentarily blinding us. Our pursuers had reached the bottom. "There they are," a gruff voice shouted from below. "Olivia, you go first," Diane said, her voice steady despite the dire situation. "Derek and I will hold them off." I wanted to argue, to say we should stay together, but I knew there was no time. With shaking hands, I began to climb the metal framework of the elevator shaft. The rusty metal cut into my palms, and my muscles screamed with the effort, but I forced myself to keep moving. Below me, I could hear shouts and the sound of a scuffle. I didn't dare look down. Finally, my hand grasped the edge of the ledge. With one final push, I hauled myself up and over. I turned immediately, ready to help Derek and Diane. Derek was about halfway up, his face a mask of determination, but Diane was still in the elevator cage, grappling with a large man who had managed to climb up. "Diane!" I shouted, reaching down towards her. She looked up at me, and in that moment, I saw a mix of fear and resolve in her eyes. "Go!" she yelled. "Get to the ranger station, expose them!" Before I could respond, she pulled something from her pocket, the compass we had found earlier. With all her might, she hurled it up towards me. I caught it reflexively, confused by her action. "The evidence is inside," Diane shouted. "Now go." In that moment of distraction, the man she was fighting gained the upper hand. He pushed her hard, and with a terrifying scream, Diane fell backwards out of the elevator cage, disappearing into the darkness below. "No!" Derek and I screamed in unison. The man in the elevator looked up at us, his face twisted in a menacing grin. He reached for the control panel. "Derek, hurry!" I yelled, extending my hand to him. With a burst of energy, Derek scrambled up the last few feet. Just as my hand closed around his wrist, the elevator plummeted downwards, taking our pursuer with it. We lay on the ledge, gasping for breath, the echo of the crash reverberating through the mine. "We have to keep moving," Derek said after a moment, his voice hoarse. I nodded, clutching the compass tightly. Whatever evidence Diane had sacrificed herself for, I was determined to get it out. We found the emergency exit, a narrow tunnel that sloped upwards. As we began our ascent, I couldn't shake the image of Diane's fall from my mind. Her sacrifice had saved us, but at what cost? The tunnel seemed to go on forever, growing narrower and steeper as we climbed. Our progress was slow, hampered by exhaustion and the constant fear of pursuit. Finally, after what felt like hours, we saw a glimmer of light ahead. With renewed energy, we scrambled towards it. We emerged into the pre-dawn light, the cool mountain air a shock after the stale atmosphere of the mine. We were on a rocky outcrop. The vast expanse of Echo Ridge spread out below us. But our ordeal was far from over. In the distance, we could hear shouts and see flashlight beams sweeping the forest. The Guardians were still searching for us. "We need to get to the ranger station," I said, pulling out my phone. No signal. Derek nodded grimly. "It's going to be a race against time. Are you ready?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the compass in my pocket and the gravity of Diane's last words. "Let's finish this," I said. As the first rays of sunlight began to peek over the horizon, we set off down the mountain, carrying with us the hope of exposing the dark secrets of Echo Ridge and the heavy burden of Diane's sacrifice. The final leg of our journey was just beginning, and I knew that the true test of our courage and determination lay ahead. Whatever happened, I was resolved to see this through, for Diane, for Ryan Cooper, and for all those who had fallen victim to the shadows of Echo Ridge. The sky was turning a dark gray as the train arrived at the small Norwich station. I stepped off the carriage, carrying my old leather suitcase that I had inherited from my grandfather. My name is Thomas Harrison, a journalist in my 30s, and I had come to Norfolk in search of a story that could change the course of my professional life. I had heard about the legend of Black Shuck, the mythical black dog said to roam the Norfolk countryside for centuries. At first, I thought it was just a local myth, but after months of research, I found an intriguing pattern in reports and testimonies. There was something happening here, something beyond mere folk tales. I took an old taxi from the station to the village of Blacking, a small town on the edge of the lowlands. The driver, an old man named Harold, seemed reserved at first, but soon started chatting when I told him about the reason for my visit. "Ah, Black Shuck," Harold said, his eyes gleaming in the rearview mirror. "I've seen him myself many years ago. It was on a stormy night I was driving back from the Red Bull pub. Suddenly he appeared in the middle of the road. He was huge, the size of a small horse, and his eyes were glowing like embers. I asked him for more details, and Harold began to recount other stories he had heard over the years. Stories of lost travelers who found their way thanks to the appearance of the black dog, and others of tragic accidents preceded by the appearance of the mysterious creature. After an hour of driving through narrow country roads, we arrived at Blacking. The village was smaller than I expected, a collection of old stone houses surrounding a small central square. In the middle of the square was a small church with a stone tower that seemed to silently watch over the village. I got out of the taxi in front of the White Hart Inn, an old wooden building dating back to the 16th century. The innkeeper, Mrs. Edith Perkins, was a woman in her 60s with a friendly face and a neat appearance. "Welcome to Blacking, Mr. Harrison," she said as she took my suitcase. "I heard you're here to research Black Shuck. Well, I can tell you that you'll hear plenty of stories here." As I was checking in, I noticed an old photograph hanging on the wall behind the desk. The photo was faded and yellowed with age, but I could clearly see a large black shape standing next to the church in the center of the village. "Ah, I see you've noticed the photo," Mrs. Perkins said with a mysterious smile. "My grandfather took it in 1901. He always said it was the clearest picture of Black Shuck ever taken. Of course, most people think it's just a trick, but, well, we in Blacking know better." I went up to my room on the upper floor, a small but comfortable room with a window overlooking the village square. I sat on the bed and took out my notebook, thinking about my plan for the coming days. I knew there were many stories to uncover, many mysteries to solve. As the sun set, the village lights began to come on, one by one. I looked out the window at the growing shadows in the square, wondering if Black Shuck was also watching from somewhere in the darkness. I didn't know then that the coming days would radically change my understanding of the world, and that I would face things that challenged everything I thought was real. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of church bells. The clock showed 7 in the morning, and the sun was casting its first rays on the village square. After a quick breakfast prepared by Mrs. Perkins, I decided to start my day with a visit to the village library. The library was a small building next to the church, run by an old man named Arthur Wilkinson. When I entered, I found him sitting behind an old desk, surrounded by piles of books and documents. "Ah, you're the journalist looking for Black Shuck, aren't you?" Arthur said with a broad smile. "Well, you've come to the right place. We have records here dating back to the 16th century." I spent the next few hours diving into old records, reading about strange incidents and mysterious appearances of the black dog. There was a clear pattern. Over the centuries, Black Shuck appeared in times of crisis and major changes. One of the records that particularly caught my attention was the diary of Reverend Thomas Bradley, who was the church's pastor in the late 18th century. Bradley wrote about a personal encounter with Black Shuck. On the night of August 15, 1784, as I was returning from visiting a patient on the outskirts of the village, I saw him. He was standing in the middle of the road, huge and black as night itself. His eyes were glowing a deep red. I felt fear overtake me, but I remembered my duty as a man of God. I raised the cross I was carrying and prayed. And then something strange happened. Instead of attacking me or fleeing, the dog bowed its head as if greeting me, then disappeared into the darkness. The next day we discovered that the river had overflowed and flooded a large part of the fields. Had it not been for Black Shuck's warning, I would have taken that path and surely drowned. This account greatly intrigued me. It contradicted the stereotypical image of the black dog as an omen of doom, and instead presented a picture of a protective being. When I left the library, the sun had begun to set. I decided to walk around the village, trying to absorb everything I had read. As I was walking by the church, I noticed something strange on one of the old stone walls. There was an ancient inscription, almost invisible due to the erosion of the stone. But when I looked closely, I could clearly see the shape of a large dog carved into the stone. And beneath it, there were words in Latin: "Custos vigilat in tenebris." The guardian watches in the darkness. I returned to the inn feeling excited and puzzled at the same time. I knew I had begun to scratch the surface of a deep mystery, a mystery whose roots stretched across centuries of history. That night I sat in my room writing my notes, trying to connect everything I had discovered. While I was engrossed in writing, I heard a strange sound coming from outside the window. It was a low sound, like a growl, but it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. I got up and went to the window, staring into the darkness. I didn't see anything, but I felt a shiver run down my spine. Was that just an illusion, or was Black Shuck watching me? With the dawn of the third day, I decided to explore the area surrounding the village. The weather was cold and damp, and fog covered the neighboring fields. I started my journey on foot, heading towards the nearby forest that was the focus of many Black Shuck stories. After an hour of walking, I reached the edge of the forest. The trees were dense and old, and it seemed as if light itself hesitated to penetrate their shadows. I entered the forest cautiously, listening to the sound of my feet on the dry leaves and the creaking of branches above me. Suddenly I heard the sound of movement in a nearby thicket. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. There was something moving among the trees, something big. Was this Black Shuck? But what appeared was surprising in a completely different way. It was an old man, wearing a worn coat and carrying a wooden stick. He seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, his pale blue eyes staring at me curiously. "Hello, stranger," the man said in a hoarse voice. "What brings you to this old forest?" I introduced myself and explained why I was there. When I mentioned Black Shuck, his eyes glinted in a strange way. "Ah, the old guardian," the man whispered. "He's been here for a long time, longer than any human can remember. My name is Aldrich, and well, let's say I know this forest well." Aldrich began to tell stories about Black Shuck, stories I had never heard before. He spoke of how the black dog was originally a guardian of the boundaries between our world and another world, a world of magic and myths. But over time, Aldrich said, people forgot. They forgot the magic, forgot the old secrets. And now Black Shuck protects those who still believe, those who can still see beyond the veil of reality. I spent hours talking with Aldrich, listening to his amazing stories. When the sun began to set, I realized I needed to return to the village. "Be careful, young journalist," Aldrich said as he bid me farewell. "Knowledge is power, but it's also dangerous. And remember, in this forest, not everything is as it seems." I returned to the village with my mind spinning from everything I had heard. Was Aldrich telling the truth, or was he just an old man who liked to tell fantastical stories? That night I woke up to the sound of a deep bark coming from outside the inn. I rushed to the window, but the square was empty. However, there was something different. On the doorstep of the inn, there was something gleaming in the moonlight. When I went down to examine it in the morning, I discovered it was a strange black stone, warm to the touch despite the cold night. With the beginning of my 4th day in Blacking, I decided to talk to more village residents. I felt there were more stories and secrets that had not yet been revealed. I started by visiting the local blacksmith, a large man named George Smith. His workshop was full of old tools and wrought iron. When I asked him about Black Shuck, he stopped working and looked at me seriously. "I saw him once," George said in a low voice. "It was 10 years ago on a stormy night. I was coming back from the pub when I saw him standing in the middle of the road. He was huge, bigger than any dog I've ever seen. But the strange thing is, I didn't feel afraid. Instead, I felt safe." George told me that on that night when he returned home, he found that the roof of his house had collapsed due to the storm. If he hadn't been delayed by seeing Black Shuck, he would have been under that roof when it collapsed. Next, I visited the local school where I met the teacher, Mrs. Eileen Grant. She was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a warm smile. "Yes, we teach the children about Black Shuck," Eileen said, "but we don't present him as a frightening monster. For us, he's part of our heritage, a symbol of protection for the village." Eileen told me about an art project the students did last year, where they drew pictures of Black Shuck. She showed me some of the drawings, and it was fascinating to see how the children depicted the black dog. In some drawings, he looked scary, but in most, he was portrayed as a friendly guardian. As evening approached, I decided to visit the local pub, the Red Bull. The place was crowded, full of locals who had come to relax after a long day of work. I sat at the bar and ordered a drink. Next to me was an old hunter named Frank. When he learned I was looking for stories about Black Shuck, he smiled broadly. "Well, lad, I've got a story for you," Frank said. "About 20 years ago, I was hunting in the forest when I lost my way. Night fell and I started to feel desperate. Then, suddenly, this huge black dog appeared. He didn't come close to me, but he started walking in front of me. I followed him, and before I knew it, I was out of the forest and on the road leading to the village. As the night progressed, I heard more and more stories. Some were scary, others were amazing. But in every story, there was a common element. Black Shuck was always present in moments of crisis, either to warn or to help. When I returned to the inn late at night, My head was spinning with everything I had heard. I sat on my bed, trying to organize my thoughts. There was a pattern forming, but I couldn't quite define it. Suddenly, I heard a soft knock on my room door. When I opened the door, there was no one there. But on the floor, there was an old folded paper. When I opened it, I found a message written in old handwriting. If you want to know the truth about the Guardian, meet me at the old well at midnight tomorrow. A friend. I looked at the clock. I had less than 24 hours until the mysterious appointment. I felt excitement and fear mixing inside me. I knew I was about to discover something big, but I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. I spent most of the next day in a state of tension and anticipation. I tried to keep myself busy by reviewing my notes and conducting more interviews with villagers, but my mind was always returning to the mysterious message and the midnight appointment. As midnight approached, I snuck out of the inn. The night was cold and the sky was clear, the moon casting its pale light on the sleeping village. The old well was located on the outskirts of the village, surrounded by ancient trees that looked like silent guardians. When I arrived at the well, there was no one there. I sat on the edge of the well, listening to the sound of the wind whispering through the trees. Then I heard the sound of soft footsteps approaching. From among the shadows, a familiar figure appeared. It was Mrs. Perkins, the innkeeper. But she looked different now, more dignified and mysterious. "Hello, Thomas," she said in a calm voice. "I apologize for the secrecy, but what I'm about to tell you now cannot be heard in the light of day." Mrs. Perkins began to speak, and her words radically changed my understanding of the world. She told me that she was part of a secret group, guardians who had been protecting the secret of Black Shuck for generations. "Black Shuck is not just a legend," she said. "He's an ancient being, a guardian of the boundaries between our world and other worlds. He's been here for thousands of years, protecting humans from forces they cannot understand." She told me that Blacking was a point of intersection between worlds, a place where the veil between reality and fantasy was thin, and that Black Shuck was the guardian who prevented dangerous forces from crossing this veil. "But why are you telling me all this?" I asked, stunned by what I was hearing. "Because we need your help," she answered. "The veil is weakening, and the forces trying to cross are growing stronger. We need someone who can spread the story, not as a myth, but as a warning. We need someone who can awaken the old faith in people." Suddenly, we heard a deep bark coming from the nearby forest. I looked at Mrs. Perkins, who seemed very tense. "He's here," she whispered. "Black Shuck." From among the trees, a huge black shape appeared. It was bigger than any dog I had ever seen in my life, almost the size of a small horse. His eyes were glowing a deep red, and his fur seemed to absorb the light around him. I felt fear overtake me, but Mrs. Perkins put her hand on my shoulder reassuringly. "Don't be afraid," she said. "He's here to help us." Black Shuck slowly advanced towards us. As he approached, I felt a wave of energy emanating from him. It wasn't frightening energy, but strong and protective. "Thomas," Mrs. Perkins said in a serious voice, "what you're about to see now will change your life forever. Are you ready?" I nodded, unable to speak. Mrs. Perkins pulled out a strange necklace from under her clothes. It held a black stone similar to the one I had found on the doorstep of the inn. "This is the Guardian Stone," she explained. "It allows us to see the world as Black Shuck sees it." She placed the stone in my hand, and suddenly everything changed. The world around me seemed to ripple and change. I saw threads of light connecting everything, the trees, the ground, even the air itself. And in the midst of all this, Black Shuck was glowing with a strong light. "What is this?" I asked, amazed. "This is the truth," Mrs. Perkins answered. "This is the world as it really is. All those threads are links between our world and other worlds, and Black Shuck is the guardian who maintains the balance of these links." Suddenly I saw something moving in the shadows. It was a dark shape, moving in an unnatural way. I felt terror overtake me when I realized that this thing was trying to penetrate one of the links. Black Shuck moved with amazing speed. He pounced on the shadowy figure, and I watched a strange battle unfold before my eyes. It was like a dance of light and darkness, moving faster than my eyes could follow. And after what seemed like an eternity, the battle ended. The shadowy figure disappeared, and Black Shuck returned to us, looking tired but victorious. "This is what happens every night," Mrs. Perkins said. "Black Shuck protects us from things we can't even imagine. But the battles are getting harder, and the enemies are growing stronger." I returned the stone to her, and the world returned to its familiar nature. But I felt that I would never look at it the same way again. "Why me?" I finally asked. "Why did you choose me to see all this?" Mrs. Perkins smiled a sad smile. "Because we need your help, Thomas. We need someone who can tell the world about Black Shuck, not as a legend but as a truth. We need someone who can awaken the old faith in people, because without this faith, Black Shuck's power weakens, and the veil between worlds becomes more fragile." I looked at Black Shuck, who was looking at me with his deep red eyes. I felt as if he was reading my soul, testing my readiness for this task. "And what if I refuse?" I asked, although I already knew the answer. "Then we'll erase your memories of this night," Mrs. Perkins answered firmly. "And you'll return to your previous life, believing that all this was just a strange dream." I looked again at Black Shuck, then at Mrs. Perkins. I knew that my decision would change my life forever, but I also knew that I couldn't return to my old life after everything I had seen. "I agree," I finally said. "I'll help you. I'll tell the world about Black Shuck." Mrs. Perkins smiled, and Black Shuck seemed to nod his head in silent approval. "All right then," Mrs. Perkins said. "Let's begin your training. You have a lot to learn, and we don't have much time." And so began my true journey, a journey that would take me into the depths of ancient secrets and put me face to face with forces beyond imagination. But I knew I wasn't alone. I now had a powerful ally, the legendary black dog, Black Shuck. The following weeks were the most exciting and exhausting of my life. Under the guidance of Mrs. Perkins and other members of the Border Guards, as they called themselves, I began to learn the secrets of a world I had been unaware of until recently. I learned how to use the Guardian Stone to see the links between worlds. I learned about the history of Black Shuck and how it was intertwined with human history itself. I discovered that there were many black dogs around the world, each protecting a specific area. But the most important lesson was learning how to communicate with Black Shuck himself. It wasn't easy. He didn't speak in words as we do. Instead, he communicated through images, feelings, and sensations. One night, while I was practicing communicating with him in the forest, something unexpected happened. Suddenly, I was overwhelmed by a wave of memories. But they weren't my memories. They were Black Shuck's own memories. I saw images from ancient times, civilizations forgotten by history, and creatures that had not yet set foot on Earth. I saw Black Shuck fighting monsters from nightmares, protecting the early humans from unimaginable dangers. When the vision ended, I found myself sitting on the ground, breathing heavily. I looked at Black Shuck, who was looking at me with his deep eyes. "Why did you show me all this?" I asked him in my mind. The answer came in the form of a strong feeling, a sense of responsibility and duty. I understood that Black Shuck was trying to show me the importance of our mission and how our existence was necessary for the continuation of life as we know it. As time passed, I became more proficient in using my new abilities. I learned how to see the subtle signs that indicated abnormal activity and how to help Black Shuck in repelling small threats. But all of this was just preparation for what was coming. One night, I woke up to the urgent barking of Black Shuck. When I looked out of my window in the inn, I saw the sky glowing with a strange red color. I rushed outside, where I found Mrs. Perkins and the rest of the guards gathering. "It has begun," Mrs. Perkins said in a grave voice. "The big attack we've been fearing. The veil is tearing and we have to stop it before it's too late." I looked at Black Shuck, who was standing beside me. I felt his determination and strength flowing through my veins. I knew that this moment was what I had been training for. "What do we need to do?" I asked, ready to face anything. "We need to go to the center of the storm," Mrs. Perkins answered. "To the place where the veil is thinnest. And there we'll fight a battle for the future of our world." And so, we began our journey into the unknown, unsure of what we would face, but determined to protect our world at any cost. Black Shuck was leading the way, and I was walking beside him, ready to face whatever might come our way. I didn't know what awaited us, but I knew one thing. This night would determine the fate of our world, and I was determined to be part of saving it. Led by Black Shuck, we set off through the dark forest. The air was heavy with strange energy, and the sky glowed with colors I had never seen before. It felt as if the world itself was breathing, pulsing with an eerie, frightening rhythm. After an hour of walking, we reached the edge of a small lake. Its waters were black as ink, reflecting the strange colors in the sky. And in the center of the lake, I saw something that made my heart stop for a moment. There was a huge vortex of light, slowly rotating and pulsing with power. "This is the center," Mrs. Perkins whispered, "the place where the veil between worlds is tearing." Suddenly the ground began to shake beneath our feet. From the vortex, strange shapes began to appear. Creatures from nightmares, ghosts and shadows moving in unnatural ways. Black Shuck let out a powerful bark, and I felt a wave of energy emanate from him. The other guardians spread out around the lake, each holding their guardian stones. I gripped mine tightly, feeling its warmth pulsing in sync with my racing heart. "Remember your training, Thomas," Mrs. Perkins said, her voice steady despite the chaos around us. "Focus on the links. Strengthen them. Don't let the darkness break through." I closed my eyes and concentrated on the guardian stone. When I opened them again, I could see the world as I had that first night. Threads of light connecting everything, now vibrating violently as the creatures from the vortex tried to break through. Black Shuck charged forward, his form seeming to grow larger, more majestic. He engaged the nightmarish creatures, his teeth and claws glowing with an otherworldly light. The other guardians raised their stones, streams of energy flowing from them to reinforce the weakening barriers. I focused all my will on the stone in my hand, picturing the threads of light growing stronger, pushing back against the invading darkness. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, every fiber of my being straining against forces I could barely comprehend. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. The sky above us churned with unnatural colors, the very fabric of reality seeming to warp and twist. Black Shuck fought tirelessly, his spectral form darting between dimensions as he drove back creature after creature. Just when I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, when the strain of channeling so much energy felt like it would tear me apart, I heard a sound that cut through the chaos, the deep, resonant toll of a bell. I looked toward the village and saw an incredible sight. The old church tower was glowing with a soft golden light. As the bell continued to ring, I saw threads of that same light stretching out from the tower, intertwining with the energy from our guardian stones. "The old faith," Mrs. Perkins gasped, her face alight with joy and wonder. "The villagers, they're believing again." With this new surge of power, we redoubled our efforts. Black Shuck let out a howl that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. The vortex in the lake began to shrink, the nightmarish creatures being pulled back into it. With a final thunderous crash, the vortex collapsed in on itself. The strange lights in the sky faded, and the oppressive energy that had filled the air dissipated. We had done it. We had closed the breach. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I looked around at my fellow guardians. We were exhausted, drained in ways I couldn't even describe, but alive. Black Shuck padded over to me, his red eyes now soft and warm. I reached out and for the first time felt his fur under my hand. It was like touching living shadow, cool and comforting. "It's not over, you know," Mrs. Perkins said, coming to stand beside me. "There will always be threats, always be those who seek to breach the veil. But now, thanks to you, we're stronger than ever." I nodded, understanding the weight of the responsibility I had taken on. "So what happens now?" I asked. Mrs. Perkins smiled. "Now, Thomas Harrison, you have a story to tell. A true story. One that will awaken the old faith in people far beyond our little village. Are you ready for that?" I looked at Black Shuck, at the other guardians, at the village in the distance where ordinary people had just played a part in saving the world without even knowing it. I thought of all I had learned, all I had experienced, and I knew there was only one answer I could give. "Yes," I said, "I'm ready." As we walked back to the village, the sun rising behind us, I began to think about how I would tell this story. It would be a tale of mystery and magic, of ancient guardians and modern faith. A story of a journalist who came looking for a legend and found a reality beyond his wildest imagination. But most of all, it would be the story of Black Shuck, the guardian in the shadows, the protector at the edge of reality. And as long as there were those who believed, who remembered the old tales and respected the ancient ways, he would always be there, watching over us all. In the fog-laden hills of Yorkshire, where ancient stones whisper tales of centuries past and every crooked lane holds a story, my name stands as testament to an extraordinary series of events that forever changed my perspective on fear and reality. I am Penelope Ashworth, and this is the tale of how I discovered that the most terrifying things often hide in plain sight, lurking not in the shadows of our darkest nightmares, but in the mundane corners of our everyday lives. The story I'm about to share might seem fantastic, perhaps even unbelievable to some, but I swear upon everything I hold dear that every word is true, every detail exactly as it happened during those strange and unsettling months when my family and I found ourselves residing in what we believed to be a haunted house in Yorkshire. The experience taught me valuable lessons about perception, fear, and the extraordinary power of the human mind to create monsters out of shadows, and sometimes out of something as ordinary as a pair of shoes. Being the daughter of a British Home Office employee has meant living a life of perpetual transition, never quite belonging anywhere, and always existing on the periphery of social circles that form and dissolve like morning mist around me. My father, Rupert Ashworth, whose dedication to his work has shaped our family's nomadic existence, moves us from place to place with clockwork regularity, each new assignment bringing with it a fresh start and the challenge of adapting to unfamiliar surroundings. My mother, Victoria, ever the optimist, tries to make each move an adventure, but I've seen the worry lines deepen around her eyes with every relocation, watched as she struggles to maintain her cheerful facade while packing up our lives into cardboard boxes yet again. Together we form a tight-knit unit of 3 humans and 3 cats, our small family caravan moving across the English countryside like modern-day gypsies, never quite finding home but always searching for it. The constant upheaval has left its mark on all of us, but perhaps most notably on me. I've learned to be self-sufficient, to find comfort in solitude, and to approach new situations with a mix of curiosity and caution that has served me well. Or at least, it did until we moved into that house. The day we arrived at our new residence in Yorkshire remains etched in my memory with crystal clarity, every detail preserved like an insect in amber, waiting to be examined and re-examined as I try to make sense of what followed. The house stood apart from its neighbors. a looming Victorian structure of weathered red brick and tall, narrow windows that seemed to watch our approach with malevolent interest. The autumn air carried a bitter chill that day, but the cold I felt as we pulled up the gravel driveway came from somewhere deeper, somewhere primal that recognized danger, even if my conscious mind refused to acknowledge it. The house itself appeared to have been designed by someone with a Gothic sensibility and a flair for the dramatic. All steep angles and sharp corners, with elaborate cornices and a tower that rose like an accusing finger pointing at the perpetually gray Yorkshire sky. Ivy crawled up the walls like grasping fingers, and the windows, despite being recently cleaned according to the property manager, seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The overall effect was deeply unsettling, as if the house itself was alive and aware, sizing us up as potential prey rather than new occupants. My mother's attempt at optimism sounded forced even to her own ears as she asked for my opinion, her voice carrying a slight tremor that she tried to disguise with a cough. My father's reassurances about the house's safety and recent renovations rang hollow in the still air, his words seeming to be swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere that surrounded us. Even our cats, usually curious about new surroundings, huddled in their carriers, refusing to emerge even after we'd brought them inside. The weeks that followed our move seemed to confirm my initial misgivings about the house, as a series of increasingly disturbing events began to unfold around us. At first it was subtle. Objects that would mysteriously relocate themselves when no one was looking. The sudden appearance of cold spots in rooms that had been warm moments before, and most unsettling of all, the constant sound of breathing that seemed to emanate from within the walls themselves. The sound, a rhythmic hiss, hiss, became my constant companion, following me from room to room like an invisible stalker. My parents, ever practical and grounded in reality, dismissed my concerns with well-meaning but frustrating explanations about old houses and their tendency to make strange noises. They attributed the moving objects to our cats, the cold spots to drafts, and the breathing sound to the wind working its way through the old ventilation system. But their explanations, however logical, failed to account for the shadowy figures I glimpsed darting just out of sight, or the deep sense of unease that permeated every corner of our new home. I began to dread nightfall, knowing that the darkness would bring with it an intensification of the phenomena that plagued us. The breathing would grow louder, the shadows more bold in their movements, and the feeling of being watched would become almost unbearable. Driven by a combination of fear and curiosity, I began to investigate the history of our new home, spending countless hours in the local library poring over dusty archives and microfiche records that detailed the house's dark past. The library itself became a sanctuary of sorts, its musty atmosphere and flickering fluorescent lights offering a strange comfort compared to the oppressive environment of our house. Mrs. Graves, the elderly librarian who seemed to have been a fixture of the building for as long as anyone could remember, watched my research with growing concern, her rheumy eyes following my progress as I uncovered article after article about mysterious disappearances and unexplained phenomena connected to our address. The stories stretched back decades, each more disturbing than the last. Tales of families who fled in the night, of strange sounds and inexplicable occurrences, of people who entered the house and were never seen again. Mrs. Graves finally approached me one afternoon, her ancient hands trembling as she gripped my arm with surprising strength, warning me that some secrets were better left undiscovered. Her cryptic warning, delivered in a whisper that seemed to carry echoes of personal experience, only served to intensify my determination to uncover the truth about our home. The culmination of my investigation led to a series of nighttime explorations, each more terrifying than the last, as I attempted to document and understand the supernatural phenomena that seemed to have taken residence alongside us. Armed with nothing more than a flashlight and my own determination, I would creep through the darkened corridors of our home, following the sound of breathing that had become almost deafening in the midnight hours. The cats would watch my progress with unblinking eyes, sometimes hissing at empty corners or arching their backs at invisible threats. It was during one of these nocturnal expeditions that I encountered the figure, a tall, misty form that seemed to coalesce from the shadows at the end of the hallway. The encounter left me frozen in terror, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would wake my parents. When I finally found my voice and called out, the figure's response was to rush toward me with frightening speed, sending me fleeing back to my room in panic. The deep scratches that appeared on my bedroom door overnight finally convinced my parents that something truly unusual was happening in our home. The arrival of Hector Blackwood, the local paranormal investigator, marked a turning point in our understanding of the situation. A gruff, no-nonsense type who had clearly seen his share of genuine supernatural phenomena, Blackwood approached the investigation with professional detachment that quickly gave way to visible unease as he experienced the house's phenomena firsthand. His equipment, an impressive array of cameras, recording devices, and various instruments designed to detect paranormal activity, seemed to malfunction in bizarre ways within our home. The night he spent investigating proved to be one of the most active we'd experienced, with the breathing sound reaching an almost unbearable volume, and the shadowy figures becoming bold enough to manifest even in his presence. The next morning, Blackwood's usual professional demeanor had cracked, revealing genuine fear as he urged us to leave the house immediately. His warning, coming from someone who dealt with supernatural occurrences for a living, carried significant weight, but unfortunately we had nowhere else to go. The resolution to our haunting came on a particularly stormy Friday night, when my parents had left me alone in the house to attend a dinner party they couldn't avoid. The wind howled through the eaves like a chorus of lost souls, and rain lashed against the windows with almost supernatural force. The breathing sound, which had become my constant companion over the weeks, seemed louder than ever, echoing through the empty house with a rhythmic persistence that finally drove me to action. Armed with my trusty flashlight and a desperate need to end the mystery once and for all, I began a methodical search of the house, following the sound to its source. The investigation led me to the kitchen where the breathing seemed to reach a crescendo, surrounding me on all sides until I could barely hear my own thoughts over its persistent shh, shh. And there, in a moment of almost anticlimactic revelation, I discovered the truth. My new trainers, carelessly left by the kitchen door, had developed a small tear in their air-cushioned soles. Each gust of wind that found its way under the door would force air through the tear, creating the exact sound that had terrorized us for weeks. The wave of relief and embarrassment that washed over me in that moment was almost overwhelming. All those nights of fear, all the research, all the supernatural theories, and the source of our haunting turned out to be nothing more than a defective pair of shoes. The moving objects could easily be explained by our curious cats, the cold spots by the house's aging ventilation system, and the shadowy figures by nothing more than an overactive imagination, fueled by fear and suggestion. Even Mr. Blackwood's equipment malfunctions could likely be attributed to the house's old and unreliable electrical system. The scratches on my door, upon closer inspection in the light of day, matched perfectly with the marks our cats often left when demanding attention. The entire experience served as a powerful reminder of how the human mind, when primed for fear, can transform the most mundane occurrences into supernatural phenomena. In the aftermath of my discovery, our family's relationship with the house underwent a dramatic transformation. What had once seemed dark and threatening became simply an old, characterful home with its own quirks and creaks. My parents found the humor in the situation, particularly after I demonstrated how the shoes were creating the ghostly breathing sound, and even Mr. Blackwood, when called back to witness the revelation, managed to laugh at how thoroughly we had all been fooled. The experience taught us all valuable lessons about the power of perception and the importance of seeking rational explanations before jumping to supernatural conclusions. We continued to live in that Victorian house in Yorkshire, and while it still occasionally surprised us with unexpected noises or drafty corners, we had learned to approach such occurrences with amusement rather than fear. Most importantly, I learned to check my shoes regularly for signs of wear. After all, one never knows when a simple pair of trainers might decide to moonlight as a ghost. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink as we drove down the winding back roads. The six of us, fresh out of high school and eager for one last adventure before college, chattered excitedly about the camping trip ahead. Little did we know, our carefree getaway was about to take a terrifying turn. I was 17 then, a social butterfly always seeking the next thrill. My tight-knit group of friends, my girlfriend Stephanie, my buddy Brandon and his girl Kaylee, and Steve with his girlfriend Sarah, had been through thick and thin together. This trip was our chance to make some unforgettable memories before life pulled us in different directions. But as the miles ticked by and the houses grew fewer and farther between, an uneasy feeling crept over me. The air seemed to thicken with an unspoken menace, hinting at the horrors to come. If only I had heeded that instinct. But in the reckless invincibility of youth, I brushed it aside, eager to embrace whatever challenges lay ahead. After hours of driving, we finally found the perfect spot, a secluded clearing deep in the heart of the woods. It was just remote enough to feel like an adventure, but with a few scattered houses nearby to provide a sense of safety. Or so we thought. Piling out of Steve's spacious Honda Pilot, we stretched our cramped limbs and breathed in the crisp forest air. Setting up camp took over an hour as we pitched our 3 tents, one for each couple. As a former Boy Scout, I made sure we had all the essentials: food, water, flashlights, and being rebellious teens, we made sure to pack plenty of booze and weed too. As the tents took shape, Brandon and I ventured into the woods to gather firewood. We stumbled upon a narrow trail snaking into the undergrowth and made a mental note to explore it later. By the time we returned, the sun was setting and it was time to relax. That first night passed uneventfully as we drank, smoked, and laughed around the campfire before eventually slipping off to our respective tents. Stephanie snuggled up close to me and I allowed myself to believe this would be the trip of a lifetime, blissfully unaware of the waking nightmare ahead. The next morning, as Brandon and Kaylee stayed behind for some alone time, Stephanie, Steve, Sarah, and I set off to check out that intriguing trail from yesterday. About 20 minutes in, Steve spotted something ahead, a decrepit metal fence guarding an old cemetery. Approaching cautiously, we saw the cemetery wasn't quite abandoned. Faded flowers and tattered notes were propped against crumbling headstones, hinting at recent visitors. But this was no cultish voodoo hotspot, just a forgotten burial ground slowly being reclaimed by nature. Beyond the graveyard, a wider trail rutted with tire tracks led to what looked like a rudimentary parking area. Curious, we followed the trail a bit farther until a herd of grazing deer startled us with their sudden appearance. It was a peaceful scene, but with daylight fading, we had to turn back before dark consumed the forest. That night, we kicked the partying into high gear, determined to finish off our ample alcohol and cannabis supply so as not to haul it home. The booze flowed, the laughter echoed, and the stars twinkled merrily above. When we finally stumbled off to bed, we expected another peaceful night like the last, but oh, how wrong we were. It was a blood-curdling scream that wrenched me violently from sleep. Disoriented, heart pounding out of my chest, I sat bolt upright as the terrible shriek faded into a gurgle. It was coming from Steve and Sarah's tent. Even as Stephanie and I struggled to free ourselves from our tangled sleeping bags, the unmistakable sound of ripping fabric filled the air. Something sharp was tearing their tent apart. From within, The panicked beam of a flashlight cut erratic paths across the tent fabric. I heard Steve roar in pain and surprise, then the snap and crunch of what sounded like his heavy maglite connecting with flesh and bone. Suddenly, Steve and Sarah came tumbling out of the ruined tent, fear etched across their faces in the moonlight. Our campsite erupted into chaos. Stephanie screamed. Brandon and Kaylee poked their heads groggily out of their tent to see what the commotion was. Frantically, I scanned the perimeter of our little clearing for any sign of the attacker, but the forest remained dark and inscrutable. Steve, thinking quicker than the rest of us, made a beeline for his car, Sarah hot on his heels. He had parked closest to their tent but farther from ours and the trail. That meant to follow him, the rest of us would have to run right past the spot where the assailant had struck. Even as this realization dawned, the beam of Steve's brake lights cut red swathes through the darkness as his Pilot roared to life. We were being left behind. But just before he punched the gas, Steve leaned out the window and yelled a single vital word: "Cemetery!" In a flash, I understood. The trail on the far side of the graveyard was our best avenue of escape. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Stephanie's hand in one of mine and my cell phone in the other. The narrow cone of my phone's flashlight danced frenetically ahead of us as we crashed through the underbrush, Brandon and Kaylee close behind. From somewhere behind us, way too close, heavy footsteps bore down like a predator with our scent. We hit the cemetery at a dead sprint. I practically threw Stephanie over the fence before vaulting it myself. Brandon and Kaylee followed, breathing raggedly. As we plunged into the sheltering darkness between the tombstones, I killed my light. In the renewed blackness, we hunkered down and tried to control our ragged breathing. Where was Steve? It felt like hours waiting there in the dark, but it couldn't have been more than a minute or two. Then, from the direction of the fence, a metallic rattle, the sound of someone climbing over. My heart lodged in my throat as the crunch of heavy footsteps continued toward our hiding spot. There's something about moments of mortal terror that brings everything into razor focus. As those ponderous footsteps drew ever closer, I was suddenly acutely aware of the small Swiss Army knife in my jeans pocket. As if moving of its own accord, my hand closed around the knife. By some horrible luck, the footsteps were coming straight toward me. I could hear the intruder's breathing now, labored and raspy. Unbidden, my mind conjured an image of a hulking figure with a twisted, inhuman face looming over me. I had to physically bite my tongue to keep from whimpering. Another step. He had to be right on top of me now. I held my breath and braced, trying to meld with the earth and headstone at my back. The next step never came. Instead, a long, considering pause. He was listening for us, searching, and then, so close I swear I felt the disturbance in the air, a dark shape crouched down mere inches in front of me. Fight or flight, the most primal of instincts, exploded like a supernova in my brain. In a blur of panic and adrenaline, I lunged forward, drawing the knife from my pocket and burying it to the hilt in what I desperately hoped was his leg. The effect was instantaneous. The figure let out an inhuman howl of agony and crashed to the ground as his leg gave out. Something metallic, something huge, clattered from his grasp. A heartbeat later, twin beams of light knifed through the darkness. A car with its brights on, Steve tearing around the corner of the parking lot. As one, the four of us erupted from our hiding spots and sprinted for the fence. In the chaotic strobe of the car's headlights, I caught a single terrifying glimpse of our attacker as I hurdled the cemetery gate. A huge, hulking man with a face contorted in rage and pain. One hand clutched to his wounded leg, the other still reaching for the massive machete that lay just out of reach. Then I was in the car, diving headlong into the back seat, dragging Stephanie in with me. Brandon and Kaylee were clambering into the front. The doors were barely closed before Steve stomped the gas and the Pilot's tires screamed as we fishtailed out onto the road. The drive was a blur of terror and relief. The girls wept openly while the guys sat in stunned, exhausted silence, the adrenaline slowly leaching from our systems. We drove aimlessly at first, just needing to put distance between us and that place. After a time, Steve pulled into the first driveway we came across. The porch light flicked on as we approached the door, revealing a small, cozy farmhouse. The door opened before we could even knock, and we found ourselves face to face with a kindly-looking elderly couple. Our ragged, bloodshot eyes and trembling hands told our story for us. Within minutes they had us inside, pressing warm mugs of tea into our hands, offering us the safety and comfort of their home for the night. We slept poorly, jolting awake at every nighttime sound, but we slept. In the morning, fortified by a hearty farm breakfast and armed with the elderly man's hunting rifle, we returned to our campsite to collect what was left of our ravaged belongings. The police were called, statements were given, promises were made to find the monster who had attacked us, but he was never caught. The experience drove a wedge between us all. There were too many memories there, too much trauma bonding us together. Slowly we drifted apart, each seeking to process the horror in our own way. It's been a year now, and yet the memories of that night still haunt my dreams. I see his face sometimes, twisted in agony and rage. I feel the phantom resistance as my tiny knife sank into his flesh, and I wonder always what would have happened if any single factor had been different that night. If there is a lesson in this, it is to never underestimate the darkness that can lurk in the hearts of men. But more than that, it is to cherish the light, the laughter, the love of those close to you. Because in a world where such evil exists, it is those bonds, those moments of joy and connection, that make it all worthwhile. To anyone reading this, I implore you, be safe. Stick to the well-traveled paths and the populated campgrounds. Keep your loved ones close, and always, always trust your instincts. The world can be a beautiful place, but it can also be cruel and terrifying. Walk through it with open eyes and guarded heart, and maybe, just maybe, you can come out the other side intact. My name is Gus Halverson, and I've been the sheriff in this quiet town of Denton, Kentucky for a good 20 years now. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and the biggest scandal usually involves someone's dog getting into the neighbor's chicken coop. I've always liked it that way, calm and predictable. But then there was that summer of 2005. I'd like to tell you it was an ordinary day when it all started, but that wouldn't be true. It was a warm June morning when everything changed. I was sitting in my office, sipping on my fourth cup of coffee of the morning. My deputy, Marnie Jeffers, a bright young woman fresh out of the academy, was going through some paperwork at her desk. "Hey, Gus," she said, not looking up. "Did you hear about the new baker in town?" I chuckled. "What's this, the latest Denton gossip?" "No, seriously, her name's Eliza. Moved into the old Henderson place. Makes the best damn muffins I've ever had." "Maybe I'll stop by and check it out," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. Small towns thrived on little bits of newness like this. Just then, the phone rang. Marnie picked it up, and I watched her face go from relaxed to tense in an instant. "Sheriff," she said, holding out the receiver. "It's Hank Peters. He's found something weird." I took the phone. "Hank, what's up?" "Gus, you better get out here," Hank said, his voice shaking. "It's about Marcy Lewis. I found her car. It's all messed up and there's blood." Marcy was a local school teacher, known for her kindness and patience. "Where are you?" "Off Route 16 near the old logging road." "We'll be there in 10, I said, hanging up. "Come on, Marnie, we've got a situation." The drive to Route 16 was quick, but my mind was racing. Marcy was the last person anyone would want to harm. When we arrived, Hank was standing by the side of the road, his face pale. Marcy's car was there, all right. Doors open, blood on the seats. "Jesus, Hank," I muttered. "What the hell happened?" "I don't know, Sheriff. I just found it like this. I was out looking for some good fishing spots. Marnie was already snapping pictures and marking evidence. There's a trail of blood leading into the woods, she noted. We're gonna need backup, I said, pulling out my radio. But let's take a quick look, see if we can find her. Marnie and I followed the blood trail, which led us deeper into the woods. The further we went, the quieter it got, like the whole forest was holding its breath. After about 100 yards, we found Marcy. She was alive, but barely, tied to a tree and beaten badly. Marnie, call for an ambulance now, I said, checking her pulse. Marcy's eyes fluttered open. Gus, he's crazy. Who did this to you? I asked, but she passed out before she could answer. We stayed with her until the paramedics arrived. Then I turned to Marnie. We need to find out who did this, and fast. Back at the station, we started piecing together what we knew. Marcy had been last seen the previous evening, leaving the school around 6 p.m. She lived alone, no known enemies. It didn't make sense. While Marnie was working on tracing Marcy's last movements, I got a call from the hospital. Sheriff Halverson, it's Dr. Reiner. Marcy's stable but in bad shape. She's got some internal bleeding, broken ribs, and severe bruising, but she'll pull through. That's good to hear, Doc. Did she say anything? Just that a man attacked her. Didn't get a look at his face. I thanked the doctor and hung up, frustration gnawing at me. We were dealing with a ghost. Later that evening, I headed to Eliza's bakery, hoping to clear my mind. The place was cozy, smelling of fresh bread and cinnamon. Eliza herself was behind the counter, a petite woman with a warm smile. Hey, Sheriff, she said. What can I get you? Just a coffee, thanks. As she poured, I noticed her hands were steady, her demeanor calm. Been a busy day? You could say that, I replied. Ever since Marcy's attack, everyone's on edge. Eliza frowned. Terrible thing, that. Do you have any leads? Not yet, but we'll find him. I took my coffee and sat down, trying to shake off the unease. Over the next few days, we questioned everyone who might have seen or heard something. No one had. It was like Marcy's attacker had vanished into thin air. Then, just as we were starting to run out of leads, another woman went missing. Marnie burst into my office, eyes wide. Gus, it's Jenna Powell. Her husband said she never came home last night. Jenna was another well-liked resident, always volunteering at the community center. We need to move fast, I said. Get a search party together. Same area as Marcy? Looks like it, Marnie replied. The search for Jenna was grueling. We combed through the woods, checking every nook and cranny. Finally, after hours of searching, we found her. She was dead, her body hidden under a pile of leaves. The scene was brutal, and it shook me to my core. Back at the station, I gathered my team. All right, listen up. We've got a serial attacker on our hands. Marcy was lucky, but Jenna wasn't. We need to find this guy before he strikes again. We worked round the clock, pulling in anyone who might have seen something, anything. We increased patrols, set up checkpoints, and advised the townsfolk to be vigilant. Despite our efforts, we were always one step behind. A week later, there was another incident. This time it was Carol Swanson, the librarian. She was found dead in her home, her throat slit. There were no signs of forced entry, which meant she knew her attacker. The town was in a state of panic, and I felt the weight of every unsolved case pressing down on me. One night, as I was going over the files yet again, a thought struck me. What if the attacker wasn't from outside the town? What if he was one of us? I called Marnie into my office. Marnie, I need you to pull up the records of everyone who's moved to Denton in the last year. I want to know everything about them. She nodded and got to work. It was a long shot, but we had to try something different. While Marnie was digging through the records, I decided to pay Eliza another visit. Her bakery had become a bit of a refuge for me, a place where I could think. Hey, Sheriff, she greeted me. You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders. Feels like it, I admitted. Notice anything strange? She raised an eyebrow. Strange how? Just anything out of the ordinary. New faces, odd behavior. She thought for a moment. Well, there was that guy who moved into the old Miller place. Quiet type, keeps to himself. But then again, a lot of people are like that. Yeah, but I'm looking for someone who might stand out. Maybe someone who's been asking questions, acting suspiciously. Eliza shook her head. Sorry, Sheriff. Wish I could help more. I thanked her and left, my mind still racing. Marnie had compiled a list of recent arrivals by the time I got back to the station. There were 5 names, and one stood out, Kevin Marsh. He had moved to Denton 6 months ago, lived alone, and worked odd jobs around town. We need to talk to him, I said to Marnie. First thing tomorrow. The next morning, we headed to Kevin's place. It was a run-down house on the edge of town, overgrown with weeds. I knocked on the door, and after a moment, Kevin answered. He was a tall, gaunt man with piercing blue eyes. Sheriff, what can I do for you? He asked, a hint of wariness in his voice. We just have a few questions, Kevin. Mind if we come in? He hesitated, but then stepped aside. The inside of the house was as shabby as the outside, cluttered with papers and old furniture. We sat down, and I got straight to the point. Kevin, where were you the nights Marcy, Jenna, and Carol were attacked? His eyes flickered. I was home, alone. I don't get out much. That's convenient, Marnie said, her tone sharp. Look, I don't know what you think, but I had nothing to do with those attacks. We're just covering all our bases, I said, trying to keep things calm. Have you noticed anything unusual in the neighborhood? Kevin shook his head. No, like I said, I keep to myself. We left without any concrete evidence, but my gut told me we were on the right track. That evening, I decided to keep an eye on Kevin's place. If he was our guy, he'd slip up eventually. Around midnight, I saw movement. Kevin was leaving his house carrying a duffel bag. I followed him at a distance as he made his way to the woods. My heart was pounding, but I stayed quiet, keeping out of sight. Kevin stopped at a clearing and began digging. That's when I knew we had him. I radioed for backup, and within minutes, Marnie and 2 other deputies arrived. We moved in, guns drawn. Kevin Marsh, you're under arrest, I shouted. He dropped the shovel and raised his hands, but there was a cold smile on his face. You think you've got me, Sheriff? We know what you've done, I said. We've got enough to put you away for a long time. Kevin didn't resist as we cuffed him and led him back to the station. The search of his house turned up more evidence, linking him to the attacks. It was a relief, but it didn't bring back the lives lost. The town began to heal slowly. People were still wary, but the sense of community grew stronger. We held memorials for Jenna and Carol, and Marcy, though scarred, started to recover. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd missed something. Kevin was behind bars, but the questions remained. Why had he done it? What drove him to such brutality? I spent many sleepless nights pondering those questions, but answers were elusive. In the end, life went on. The bakery thrived, the town rebuilt, and I continued my duty as sheriff. We never did fully understand Kevin Marsh, but we learned to be more vigilant, to watch out for each other. And as the years passed, the memory of that summer faded, but it never truly left. It was a reminder that even in the quietest places, darkness can find a way in. It taught us all to be a little more cautious, a little more aware of the shadows that lurk just beyond the light. It's been nearly 2 decades since that fateful summer, and Denton has changed. We're not the same quiet town we once were. There's a wariness in people's eyes that wasn't there before, a knowledge that evil can touch even the most idyllic of places. Kevin Marsh is still in prison, serving multiple life sentences. He's never shown remorse, never explained why he did what he did. Sometimes in my darkest moments, I wonder if we'll ever truly know the full extent of his crimes. Marcy retired from teaching a few years back. The scars have faded, but the memories haven't. She's stronger now, a survivor who helps other victims of violent crimes. Marnie took over as sheriff when I retired, and she's doing a damn fine job. As for me, I still can't shake the feeling that we miss something. Maybe it's just the paranoia of an old lawman, but sometimes when I walk past the woods where we found Marcy, I swear I can feel eyes watching me. It's like the shadows have a life of their own, holding secrets we may never uncover. Eliza's bakery is still going strong. She's become a pillar of the community, her shop a gathering place where people come to share news and find comfort in each other's company. But even there, in the warmth of freshly baked bread and friendly chatter, I catch glimpses of unease. A sudden silence when the door opens, a quick glance over the shoulder. We've learned to live with it, this undercurrent of fear. It's made us stronger in some ways, more united. But it's also a constant reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it moves in next door, smiles at you over the fence, and waits. So if you ever find yourself passing through Denton, stop by Eliza's bakery. Have a coffee. Try one of her famous muffins. But keep your eyes open, and remember the lessons we learned that summer. Because even in the brightest of days, shadows can deepen, and the darkness is always waiting for its chance to creep in. The trees in the northern Wisconsin forest stood like silent sentinels, thick pines stretching up toward a dull gray sky. I've always liked the woods. They remind me of simpler times when life was more about survival than paperwork. But these woods aren't the comforting kind. They're old, and the quiet that settles between them isn't the peaceful kind. It's the waiting kind. It's the kind of silence that suffocates, pressing in on you until you feel like you might scream just to break it. My name's Martin Hawk, and I hunt the things that shouldn't exist. I wasn't always in this line of work. I used to be an engineer, designing bridges, helping people get from one place to another. It was a good life, stable and predictable. I had a nice apartment in Milwaukee, a decent paycheck, and weekends free to hike or fish. But all of that changed one crisp autumn night 5 years ago. I was camping alone in the Kettle Moraine State Forest, something I'd done countless times before. The night was clear, stars twinkling overhead, and a nearly full moon casting long shadows through the trees. I'd just settled into my sleeping bag when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig under a deer's hoof. This was different. A low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. I unzipped my tent, peering out into the darkness. That's when I saw it. A shadow that moved too fast, darting between trees with unnatural speed. And the eyes, God, those eyes. They reflected the moonlight like a cat's, but they were too big, too aware. They didn't belong to any animal I knew. I tried to ignore it, to chalk it up to stress or an overactive imagination. But I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, that shadow. It stuck with me, haunting my dreams and dogging my waking thoughts. I became obsessed, researching cryptozoology, folklore, anything that might explain what I'd seen. That's how I found the unit. Officially, we don't exist. We're the people who keep the dark corners of the world from spilling over into the light. A shadowy organization, funded by those who know the truth about what lurks in the darkness. They found me, actually. Approached me after I'd posted one too many questions on the right forums. Offered me a chance to find answers, and to protect others from the things that go bump in the night. I took the job without hesitation. Left my old life behind and never looked back. It's been 5 years now, and I've seen things that would turn most people's hair white. But nothing quite like what I encountered in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. It was supposed to be a routine mission. The locals had been reporting something strange. Animals found torn to pieces, hikers going missing. The higher-ups figured it was another overgrown predator, something that could be taken down quickly. But something about this one didn't sit right with me. I've been doing this long enough to trust my gut, and my gut was telling me this wasn't going to be easy. The reports came from deep within the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, a place known for its dense foliage and endless miles of uncharted land. It's the kind of place where you can get lost for days if you don't know your way around, and there's no guarantee you'll make it out. The forest spans over 1.5 million acres, a vast expanse of wilderness that's easy to disappear into. My partner on this mission was Jack Elwood. Jack was a big guy, former Marine, the kind of person you'd want by your side when things got ugly. He didn't talk much, which suited me fine. We both knew the job, knew when to keep quiet and when to move. That's what made us a good team. We started our trek into the forest early, the sun barely making its way over the horizon. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Mist clung to the ground, swirling around our feet as we moved. The first few miles were uneventful, just the usual rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds. But as we went deeper, that oppressive silence began to settle in, the kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees growing denser, their branches intertwining overhead to block out what little sunlight managed to penetrate the canopy. "This place gives me the creeps," Jack muttered, breaking the silence. "Feels like we're walking into a trap." I didn't reply, just nodded. He was right. The forest was too still, too quiet. We'd been walking for hours, and there wasn't a single sign of life, not even the usual squirrel or deer. It was like everything had fled, leaving us alone with whatever was out here. We came across the first body around noon. It was what was left of a hiker, though you wouldn't have known it at first glance. The body was torn apart, pieces of flesh and bone scattered across the forest floor. It wasn't a clean kill either. Whatever had done this had played with its prey, like a cat with a mouse. Jack swore under his breath, and I felt my stomach turn. I've seen a lot of gruesome things in my line of work, but this was something else. It wasn't just the violence of it, it was the malice behind it. This wasn't an animal killing for food. This was something enjoying the kill. We didn't say much as we continued on, following the trail of destruction. There were more bodies, 2 more hikers, a couple of campers. Each one had been torn apart, their remains left as if on display. And the smell. It was thick, clinging to the air like a shroud. The sickly sweet scent of decay mixed with something else. Something wrong. Jack and I both had our weapons drawn now, eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The forest had grown darker, the air heavier. It felt like we were walking through molasses, each step requiring more effort than the last. "It's close," Jack said, his voice low. I nodded. I could feel it too, that sense of being watched, the prickling at the back of my neck that told me we weren't alone. We were getting closer to whatever had done this, and it knew we were coming. We found it just as the light started to fade, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for us like grasping fingers. It was waiting for us in a small clearing, a hulking figure that didn't make sense in the dim light. At first I thought it was a bear, but it was too big, too misshapen. The thing stood on 2 legs, its body covered in matted fur that hung off it like tattered rags. It had long, clawed hands that dragged on the ground, leaving deep furrows in the earth. And its head was like something out of a nightmare. It looked like a wolf, but the proportions were all wrong. The snout too long, the teeth too many and too sharp. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural intelligence, fixed on us with a hunger that was all too human. The worst part was the smell, a stench that made me gag like rotting meat in stagnant water. The thing let out a noise, a low rumbling sound that made the ground vibrate beneath my feet. Jack and I raised our weapons, but the creature didn't move. It just stood there, watching us with an intelligence that sent a shiver down my spine. "We hit it with everything we've got." Jack nodded, his jaw clenched tight. "1, 2, 3. We opened fire, the sound of gunshots echoing through the trees. The creature roared, a sound that was part animal, part something else, and lunged at us. It moved faster than anything that size had any right to be, closing the distance between us in the blink of an eye. It swiped at Jack, sending him crashing into a tree with a sickening crack. I kept firing, aiming for its head, its heart, anything that might bring it down, but it just kept coming, like it was impervious to the bullets. It was on me in seconds, its claws raking across my chest. I fell back, pain lancing through me as it loomed over me, its breath hot and foul against my face. In that moment, I thought I was done for, that this was it. But then, there was a deafening crack, and the creature's head snapped back. Jack was on his feet, blood streaming down his face from a gash on his forehead. His shotgun was aimed right at the thing's face. He fired again, and this time the creature staggered, a thick, dark fluid pouring from its wounds. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the burning pain in my chest, and grabbed my rifle. I emptied the rest of the magazine into it, each shot punctuated by the creature's howls of pain and rage. Finally, mercifully, it fell to the ground with a heavy thud, its body twitching before going still. We stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, waiting for it to get back up. But it didn't. It was dead. Jack limped over to me, wincing with each step. "You all right?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was. The pain in my chest was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the realization of what we had just faced. We've dealt with cryptids before, but this was something different. Something worse. We didn't waste any time. We knew we had to get out of there before anything else showed up. We took what we could from the creature. Samples, measurements, anything that might help us understand what it was and where it came from. Trophies, they'd call them back at headquarters. We left the bodies where they were, knowing that the cleanup crew would handle the rest. As we made our way back to the extraction point, the forest seemed to close in around us, the silence once again pressing down. But this time, it wasn't the silence of something waiting. It was the silence of something finished, of a predator that had finally met its match. When we reached the clearing where our transport was waiting, I turned back to the trees one last time. The darkness between them seemed to pulse, as if the forest itself was breathing a sigh of relief. I knew that by morning, all traces of our battle would be gone. The bodies would disappear, the blood would soak into the earth. But the memory of that creature, of its eyes and its hunger, that wouldn't disappear. The proof was there, real and undeniable. Whatever it was, whatever it had been, it was dead now, and that was all that mattered. Jack clapped me on the shoulder, a grim smile on his face. "Let's get the hell out of here, Hawk." I nodded, feeling the tension slowly drain from my body. We were alive, and we'd done our job. That was enough. The chopper blades roared to life, and as we lifted off, the forest shrank below us, the clearing where the creature lay disappearing into the trees. We didn't speak during the flight back, just sat in silence, letting the adrenaline wear off. We'd survived, and that was all that counted. But as I watched the endless expanse of trees pass beneath us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd only scratched the surface of something much bigger, much darker. There were more creatures out there, more mysteries hiding in the shadows. And as long as they existed, I'd be there, hunting the things that shouldn't exist, keeping the world safe from the horrors that lurk in the dark corners of our world. As we flew back to civilization, I made a silent promise to myself. I would keep fighting, keep hunting, no matter what. Because if I didn't, who would? The world needed people like me and Jack, people willing to stare into the abyss and fight back. The hunt would go on. It had to. because in the end, the monsters were real, and someone had to stop them. The debriefing back at headquarters was grueling. Hours of questioning, medical exams, and endless paperwork. The higher-ups were interested in every detail, no matter how small. What did the creature smell like? How fast did it move? What was the consistency of its blood? I sat in a sterile room, the harsh fluorescent lights making my eyes ache, as I recounted the events for what felt like the 100th time. Jack was in another room, going through the same process. Standard procedure, they said. Had to make sure our stories matched up. But I knew the real reason. They were scared. We all were. Whatever that thing was in the forest, it wasn't supposed to exist. It defied classification, defied explanation. And if one existed, there could be more. As I spoke, I could see the fear in their eyes, hidden behind a veneer of professional detachment. They were realizing, just as I had in that forest, that the world was a much darker, much more dangerous place than they had ever imagined. After the debriefing, I was given 2 weeks of mandatory leave. Rest and recuperation, they called it. But I knew it was as much for their benefit as mine. They needed time to process what had happened, to figure out how to move forward. I spent the first few days at home trying to readjust to normal life. But how do you go back to normal after facing something like that? The creature's eyes haunted my dreams, its roar echoing in my ears every time I closed my eyes. On the 4th day, unable to stand the confines of my apartment any longer, I decided to go for a walk in the local park. It was a beautiful day, the sun shining brightly, families out enjoying the weather. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every unexpected sound made me flinch. As I sat on a bench, watching a group of kids play frisbee, an old man sat down next to me. He was well-dressed, with a neatly trimmed white beard and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" he said, his voice warm and friendly. I nodded, not really in the mood for small talk. He was quiet for a moment, then spoke again. "You've seen something, haven't you? Something you can't unsee." I turned to look at him, startled. "What do you mean?" He chuckled softly. "I recognize that look in your eyes. I've seen it before, in the mirror, many years ago." I studied him more closely now. There was something about him, a weight to his presence that I hadn't noticed before. "Who are you?" I asked. "My name is Gerald," he said, "and like you, I used to hunt the things that shouldn't exist." My heart rate quickened. Was this a test? Had the agency sent someone to check up on me? As if reading my thoughts, Gerald shook his head. "I'm not with the agency anymore. Retired years ago. But once you've been in this line of work, you never really leave it behind. It becomes a part of you." I relaxed slightly but remained cautious. "How did you know?" Like I said, I recognized the look. The way you scan your surroundings, always alert. The slight tremor in your hands. The haunted look in your eyes. He paused, his gaze distant. I had that same look after my first encounter. Despite my reservations, I found myself curious. "What was it? Your first encounter?" Gerald was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something far away. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "It was in the Boundary Waters, up in Minnesota, 1978. We'd gotten reports of something taking down moose, whole herds disappearing overnight." He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for the memory. "We thought it was just an unusually aggressive wolf pack. We were wrong. So wrong." I listened, captivated as Gerald recounted his tale. He spoke of a creature that moved through water as easily as air, with teeth like razors and eyes that glowed in the dark, of a battle that lasted through the night, of comrades lost, and a victory that felt hollow. As he spoke, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Here was someone who understood, who had been through what I had, and come out the other side. When he finished his story, we sat in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, I spoke. "How do you do it? How do you go back to normal life after seeing something like that?" Gerald turned to me, a sad smile on his face. "You don't, not really. The world has changed for you, and you've changed with it. But that's not necessarily a bad thing." He leaned in closer, his voice low and intense. "You've seen behind the curtain now. You know the truth about what's out there. And that knowledge, as terrifying as it is also a gift. Because now you can protect people. You can stand between the darkness and the light." I nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "Is that why you're here? To tell me this?" Gerald chuckled. "Partly. But also to warn you. The path you're on, it's not an easy one. It will test you in ways you can't imagine. It will take everything you have and then demand more." He placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong for a man his age. "But it's worth it. Every sleepless night, every scar, every nightmare. It's worth it to know that you're making a difference, that you're keeping the monsters at bay." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Gerald stood to leave. "Remember," he said, "you're not alone in this fight. There are others out there standing guard in the darkness. Find them, trust them. You'll need each other in the days to come." With that, he walked away, disappearing into the lengthening shadows. I sat there for a long time after he left, thinking about what he had said. The next morning, I called headquarters. I told them I was ready to come back to work. The woman on the other end of the line paused for a moment before responding. "Are you sure?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. I thought about the creature in the forest, about Jack, still recovering from his injuries, about Gerald and his warnings, about all the people out there blissfully unaware of the dangers lurking in the shadows. "I'm sure," I said, my voice steady. "There's work to be done." 2 days later, I was back at headquarters. The halls seemed different now, charged with a new energy. Or maybe it was me who had changed. Either way, I felt ready to face whatever came next. Jack was there, a bandage still on his forehead but a grin on his face. "Welcome back, partner," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Ready to get back out there?" I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. "Always." As we walked into the briefing room, I could feel the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. But it wasn't a burden. It was a purpose, a calling. The hunt would go on, and I would be there, standing guard in the darkness, keeping the monsters at bay. Because someone had to, and now I knew that someone was me. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the tranquil lake as we arrived at our familiar camping spot. It was a tradition among our close-knit circle of friends to spend a long weekend here every year, escaping the chaos of our daily lives and immersing ourselves in the serenity of nature. Little did we know that this year's trip would be etched into our memories for all the wrong reasons. The year was 2011, and our chosen campsite was nestled on the edge of a vast lake, situated on government land. It was a breathtakingly beautiful area, and during the month of May the water levels would recede, sometimes leaving the lakebed completely exposed. This phenomenon allowed adventurous souls to traverse the expanse on foot, adding an extra layer of excitement to our annual getaway. As long as campers respected the land and refrained from causing disturbances, the authorities permitted overnight stays. It was a haven for those seeking a peaceful retreat, and over the years we had created countless cherished memories here. The campsites were strategically positioned, offering a perfect balance of privacy and community. Each spot was far enough apart to provide a sense of seclusion, yet close enough to foster a spirit of camaraderie among the campers. It was the ideal setting for forging new friendships and strengthening existing bonds. This particular year, our campsite was perched atop a gentle hill, with one site situated below us and another above. As we settled in, blissfully unaware of the impending nightmare that awaited us, we couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement for the days ahead. We arrived at the campsite on a Friday afternoon, eager to leave the stresses of the week behind and embrace the tranquility of the great outdoors. As we unloaded our gear from the cars, the air was filled with laughter and lighthearted banter. It was a ritual we had perfected over the years, each of us falling into our designated roles with practiced ease. Ben, the unofficial leader of our group, took charge of setting up the tents. His tall, athletic frame made quick work of the task, and soon a small village of colorful shelters dotted the hillside. Lily and Derek, the inseparable couple, busied themselves with organizing the cooking area, their playful teasing and flirtatious glances a testament to their deep affection for one another. As for me, I found myself drawn to the shore of the lake, marveling at the way the sunlight danced across the still surface. There was something about being near the water that always brought me a sense of peace, a welcome respite from the chaos of everyday life. We spent the remainder of the day exploring the surrounding area, hiking the well-worn trails and soaking in the breathtaking vistas. The worries of the world seemed to melt away, replaced by a profound appreciation for the simple pleasures of nature. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, we gathered around the campfire, the flickering flames casting a warm glow over our faces. Laughter and stories flowed as freely as the beer we passed around, each of us savoring the companionship and the sense of belonging that came with being part of this tight-knit group. Little did we know that the tranquility of that first night would be shattered in the most horrific way imaginable. The first signs of trouble emerged on the second day of our trip. As we lounged around the campsite, nursing the after-effects of the previous night's revelry, we noticed a new group of campers setting up at the site below us. At first, we paid them little attention, too absorbed in our own relaxation to give them much thought. However, as the day wore on and the sun began to sink below the horizon, the newcomers' behavior became increasingly disruptive. Their music blared at an ear-splitting volume, the pounding bass reverberating through the once peaceful woods. Drunken shouts and raucous laughter shattered the tranquility, and a sense of unease began to settle over our group. As the night deepened and the disturbance showed no signs of abating, Ben, ever the peacemaker, decided to take action. With a determined set to his jaw, he made his way down the hill, intent on politely requesting that the rowdy campers turn down their music and keep their voices at a reasonable level. What happened next would forever be seared into our memories. A mere moments after Ben disappeared from view, we heard a shout of pain, followed by the sickening thud of a fist connecting with flesh. Ben stumbled back into our campsite, his hand clutching his face, blood seeping between his fingers. His eyes were wide with shock and anger as he recounted his encounter with the belligerent campers. "They're on drugs," he spat, wincing as he gingerly touched his swelling cheek. "I'm pretty sure of it. They're completely out of control." A palpable tension descended over our group, the carefree atmosphere of just a few hours ago replaced by a growing sense of dread. We huddled closer together, our laughter replaced by hushed whispers and nervous glances towards the campsite below. As the night wore on and the music continued to blare, I found myself growing increasingly weary. The events of the day had taken their toll, and I longed for the escape of sleep. Excusing myself from the group, I retreated to my tent, the muffled sounds of the party below fading into the background as I drifted off into an uneasy slumber. I jolted awake to the sound of screams, my heart pounding in my chest as I struggled to make sense of the chaos erupting outside my tent. Disoriented and groggy, I stumbled out into the night, my eyes widening in horror at the scene before me. Our campsite was in a state of utter pandemonium. Friends were running in every direction, their faces etched with terror. One of them was clutching their chest, a dark stain spreading rapidly across their shirt. Shouts of "Call 911" pierced the night air, mingling with the anguished cries of the wounded. As I stood there frozen in shock, the pieces of the nightmare began to fall into place. In the aftermath of Ben's confrontation with the campers below, Lily and Derek had been making their way back to our site when they crossed paths with our violent neighbors once more. In a tragic case of mistaken identity, the assailants had assumed that Derek was Ben, seeking revenge for their earlier altercation. The attack was brutal and swift. Glass bottles were smashed over Lily and Derek's heads, leaving them dazed and bleeding on the forest floor. But the horror was far from over. As the rest of our group sat around the campfire, oblivious to the danger that lurked in the shadows, 2 or 3 hulking figures emerged from the darkness. They moved with a menacing purpose, their eyes glinting with a feral intensity. In their hands, the glint of steel, a knife and a butcher's cleaver, caught the flickering light of the flames. Ben, ever the protector, rose to confront the intruders. He had barely uttered a word when one of the men lunged forward, plunging the knife deep into his chest. At the same moment, Tim, a camper from the site above who had witnessed the commotion and rushed to our aid, found himself face to face with the man wielding the butcher's knife. In a flash of blinding pain, the blade tore through his stomach, sending him crumpling to the ground. Panic consumed us, a primal fear that overrode all reason. Desperate calls to 911 were met with the grim realization that help was over half an hour away. We were on our own, our lives hanging in the balance. Tim's friends, their faces ashen with fear, loaded him into the back of a car, racing off into the night to meet the ambulance halfway. Ben, though gravely wounded, clung to life, his breaths coming in shallow gasps as we fought to stem the flow of blood from his chest. The attackers, their thirst for violence seemingly sated, melted back into the shadows, fleeing the scene in a Land Rover. My boyfriend and I, our hearts pounding in our throats, leaped into our own vehicle, speeding towards the entrance of the campground to flag down the approaching police. The night blurred into a surreal haze of flashing lights and barking dogs as the authorities launched a manhunt for the perpetrators. We huddled together, our minds reeling from the horror we had witnessed, praying for the safety of our friends and the swift capture of those responsible. In the days that followed, the true toll of that fateful night began to emerge. Tim, though he had lost a staggering amount of blood, clung to life with a tenacity that astounded the doctors. Ben, his wound less severe, faced a long road to recovery, both physical and emotional. Lily and Derek, their heads bearing the telltale marks of the brutal assault, grappled with the lingering effects of their ordeal. The possibility of a concussion hung heavy in the air, a reminder of the senseless violence that had shattered our peaceful retreat. As for the rest of us, we were left to pick up the pieces of our fractured psyches. The once welcoming woods now held a sinister edge, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a trigger for the memories that haunted our dreams. The legal proceedings that followed were a blur of courtrooms and testimonies, each of us reliving the nightmare in excruciating detail. The attackers, their minds addled by a cocktail of drugs, had been apprehended that very night, their vehicle mired in the muddy lakebed as they sought to flee the scene of their crimes. Justice, though swift, brought little comfort to our battered souls. The scars, both visible and invisible, would take far longer to heal. Years have passed since that fateful camping trip, but the memories of that night remain as vivid as ever. The bond forged in the crucible of shared trauma has proven unbreakable, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. We still gather every year, though our chosen location has changed. The once idyllic lakeside campground now holds too many painful memories, too many reminders of the darkness that lurks in the hearts of men. but we refuse to let fear dictate our lives. We continue to seek out the beauty of the natural world, to find solace in the company of those we hold dear. We have learned through bitter experience that life is a precious gift, one that can be snatched away in the blink of an eye. And so we cherish every moment, every laughter-filled night around the campfire, every breath of crisp mountain air. We hold fast to the love and friendship that sustains us, the unbreakable ties that bind us together. For in the end, it is not the darkness that defines us, but the light we choose to embrace in its wake. It is the strength we find in one another, the courage to face the unknown and emerge unbroken. And though the scars may never fade, we carry them as a badge of honor, a testament to the indomitable spirit that resides within us all.